Welcome to Whispering Willow's Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The fire in the hearth at 220B Baker Street whispered its secrets to the November shadows, casting amber light across the Persian rug where Sherlock Holmes sat cross-legged, examining a peculiar walking stick with the intensity of a jeweler appraising diamonds. The stick itself was unremarkable, oak, worn smooth by years of use, but Holmes studied it as if it contained the mysteries of the universe. Watson watched from his armchair, pipe smoke curling upward like lazy questions, the tobacco's sweet scent mingling with the smell of old books and the faint mustiness that clung to Victorian interiors like a faithful dog. Outside, London performed its evening ritual. Fog pressed against the windows, thick as cotton wool, muffling the clatter of hansom cabs and the calls of street vendors closing up their stalls. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 7 times, each chime absorbed almost immediately by the grey blanket that wrapped the city in its particular kind of embrace, damp, persistent, and oddly comforting in its familiarity. "You're brooding again," Watson observed, his voice soft, accustomed to these silences that stretched between them like cats in sunny windows. Holmes didn't look up. "I'm thinking, Watson. There's a difference, though I'll grant you the distinction grows narrow when one has nothing particularly interesting to think about." He set the walking stick aside with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unsolved puzzles. Mrs. Hudson's sister's nephew's walking stick reveals only that the nephew walks with a limp, prefers his left side, and has recently visited Brighton. Hardly the stuff of legend. "How on earth?" Watson began, then stopped himself, smiling. After all these years, he should know better than to ask. The fire crackled, and the gaslight on the wall hissed its gentle song. This was London in 1895, a city of empire and industry, where coal smoke painted the buildings black and progress marched forward with the steady determination of soldiers on parade. The British Museum was adding to its collection of world treasures. Some would say plundering, but that was an indelicate word for such a civilized age. The Underground Railway was expanding, burrowing beneath the streets like an industrious mole. And in drawing rooms across Belgravia, ladies discussed the latest Gilbert and Sullivan, while their husbands spoke in hushed tones about troubles in South Africa and the ever-complicated question of the East. It was an age of certainty wrapped in fog, of science pushing back against superstition, of gaslight conquering darkness one lamp at a time. And yet, for all its rationality, London loved its mysteries. The newspapers thrived on sensation. Jack the Ripper's shadow still lingered in Whitechapel's alleys, though the murders had ceased years before. People wanted their darkness served alongside their tea, their horror contained safely within the pages of penny dreadfuls. Holmes rose with the fluid grace of a man whose mind never quite settled into his body, crossing to the window. He pulled back the curtain, peering into the fog as if he might divine something from its swirling depths. "Nothing," he muttered. "No puzzles, no problems, no—" The sharp rap at the door interrupted him. Both men turned, And Watson saw the sudden spark in his friend's grey eyes, the look of a hunting dog catching a scent. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps creaked up the 17 stairs. Watson had counted them once during a particularly boring afternoon, and she appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless, holding a silver tray with a single telegram upon it. "Just arrived, Mr. Holmes?" The boy said it was urgent. Holmes plucked the telegram from the tray. Before Mrs. Hudson could properly set it down, his long fingers unfolding the paper with the eagerness of a child opening a Christmas gift. Watson watched his friend's face as he read, noting the slight widening of the eyes, the barely perceptible lift of one eyebrow. "Watson," Holmes said slowly, his voice carrying that particular tone of suppressed excitement. "Have you ever been to Transylvania?" Watson blinked. "I can't say that I have. Rather far afield, isn't it?" "Indeed. Approximately 1,400 miles, give or take, depending on one's route." Holmes handed the telegram to Watson, then began to pace, his dressing gown swirling behind him like theatrical curtains. "And yet, it seems Transylvania has come to us." Watson adjusted his reading glasses and examined the telegram. The words were spare, as telegrams must be when each word costs money, but they carried an unmistakable weight. "Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London. Stop urgent matter, life and death. Stop accused of vampirism. Stop need rationality. Stop count. Vasile Draculesti. Magura, Transylvania. Stop will pay handsomely. Stop." "Vampirism," Watson repeated, looking up. "Surely not." "Surely not, indeed," Holmes agreed, but his eyes gleamed with interest. "And yet, someone believes it enough to make an accusation. Or—" He paused mid-stride, pressing his fingertips together in that characteristic gesture. "Someone finds it convenient to make such an accusation. The question, my dear Watson, is which scenario presents itself in this curious case." Watson read the telegram again, noting details. The name, Draculest, carried an almost theatrical weight, something from a Gothic novel rather than real life. Count. Nobility, then, or claiming to be. Transylvania. He tried to recall what he knew of the place. Part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, wasn't it? Mountains, castles, probably. Peasants who still believed in, well, all manner of things that rational Englishmen had long since dismissed. "You're actually considering this," Watson said, and it wasn't quite a question. Holmes stopped pacing and turned to face his friend, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Watson, 3 days ago you complained that I was unbearable when unstimulated. Yesterday you suggested I was in danger of shooting more holes in the wall from sheer boredom. And now, when presented with a nobleman accused of being a creature of legend, calling for help from halfway across Europe, you ask if I'm considering it." "Point taken," Watson conceded, "though I should note that Transylvania in November sounds considerably colder than London." "Bring your warmest coat," Holmes said, already moving toward his desk, pulling out maps and railway timetables with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. "And your service revolver, though I doubt we'll encounter anything more dangerous than superstition, and, perhaps, remarkably persistent ignorance." Watson set down his pipe and moved to join Holmes at the desk. The map of Europe spread before them like a promise of adventure. His finger traced the route: London to Dover, across the Channel to Calais, then by rail through France, through Germany, into Austria, Hungary, and finally to the remote eastern reaches where the Carpathian mountains rose like ancient sentinels. The Orient Express, Holmes murmured, studying the timetable. We can catch the morning departure if we're organized. 3 days of travel, perhaps 4, depending on connections, which gives our Count time to either prove his innocence or confirm his guilt, though I suspect the truth will be neither so simple nor so satisfying. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the fog pressed closer, as if trying to peer in at these two men planning to journey toward darkness. But inside 221B Baker Street, the gaslight held steady, and the familiar comfort of books and tobacco and rational thought provided armor against any encroaching shadows. Watson found himself already mentally packing. His medical bag, certainly. Notebooks for recording the case. Warm woolens. He'd heard tales of Carpathian winters that froze the marrow. And yes, his revolver, though Holmes was likely right that it would prove unnecessary. Still, old habits from Afghanistan died hard, and one never quite knew when a weapon might provide comfort, if not actual utility. "Tell me what you know of vampire legends," Holmes said, not looking up from his timetable calculations. Watson settled into his chair, calling up memories from his somewhat haphazard education. Folklore, mainly. Creatures that rise from graves to drink the blood of the living. Various methods of protection, garlic, crucifixes, holy water, destroyed by sunlight or a stake through the heart, common across Eastern Europe, particularly in Slavic regions. Caused, I believe, by a combination of ignorance about disease, fear of death, and the universal human need to explain the unexplainable. Precisely, Holmes said, looking up with approval. Which is to say, caused by everything except actual supernatural beings. And yet, he tapped the telegram thoughtfully. Someone in Magura believes strongly enough to accuse a nobleman. That suggests either genuine fear or... He paused, eyes narrowing. Something else entirely. What sort of something else? Politics, perhaps. Economics. A land dispute. Any number of mundane motivations that might hide behind a supernatural mask. Fear is a powerful weapon, Watson, and an accusation of vampirism in a superstitious village would be considerably more effective than, say, an accusation of tax evasion. Watson nodded slowly. This was the Holmes he knew best, the one who looked past the dramatic surface to find the human machinery beneath. No ghosts, no vampires, no supernatural explanations. Only people, with their entirely natural capacities for deception, jealousy, greed, and fear. "When do we leave?" Watson asked, though he already knew the answer. "First light," Holmes replied. "I'll send a telegram to the Count informing him of our arrival. And Watson." He looked at his friend with something approaching fondness. "Pack your warmest coat. I'm told Carpathian mists are rather less forgiving than London fog." The night deepened around Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson brought up tea, strong, dark, and sweet, and the two men spent the remaining hours before dawn in preparation. Holmes pulled down volumes on Eastern European folklore from his shelves, making occasional notes in his careful handwriting. Watson checked his medical supplies, reasoning that whatever awaited them in Transylvania, illness and injury were always possible. The fire burned low, and the fog outside began to thin as dawn approached, that grey London dawn that never quite committed to full light, as if the sun itself was uncertain about disturbing the city's dreams. Church bells rang 5 o'clock, then 6, and by 7 they stood on the doorstep of 220 Walby Baker Street, with their travelling bags, Two rational Englishmen preparing to journey into the heart of superstition. A hansom cab appeared through the thinning fog like a ship emerging from clouds, the horse's breath steaming in the cold morning air. The driver, bundled against the chill, touched his cap in greeting, and within moments they were clattering through awakening London streets toward the railway station. Watson watched the familiar city roll past, the shop fronts still shuttered, the street sweepers at their morning work, the early workers trudging toward factories and offices. This was the London he knew, solid and real, built on coal and iron and the steady accumulation of wealth and empire. Soon they would leave this certainty behind, travelling toward mountains and mists and medieval fears. But he had his revolver, his medical bag, and most importantly, he had Sherlock Holmes, that peculiar genius who could unravel any mystery with nothing more than observation, logic, and his remarkable ability to see what others missed. Whatever waited for them in the Carpathian hills, whatever truth hid behind the accusation of vampirism, Watson felt certain they would uncover it. The cab turned onto Marylebone Road, and ahead, through the morning mist, Watson could see the great glass and iron arch of the railway station rising like a cathedral to progress. The Orient Express would carry them eastward, toward the unknown, toward a nobleman accused of impossible crimes, toward a village gripped by ancient fears. Holmes was already smiling, that sharp, eager smile of a man whose boredom had finally, mercifully, ended. And Watson, despite his reservations about cold mountains and long journeys, found himself smiling too. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot. The Orient Express pulled away from Victoria Station with the confident hiss of steam and progress, its wheels finding their rhythm against the rails, like a heartbeat settling into sleep. Holmes had secured them a private compartment. First class, naturally, courtesy of the Count's promise of handsome payment. And Watson found himself pressed against burgundy velvet cushions as London's grey suburbs gave way to the softer greens of the English countryside. The compartment smelled of brass polish and old leather, that particular scent of expensive travel that spoke of diplomatic pouches and wealthy tourists pursuing culture across the continent. Their luggage had been stowed overhead, and Holmes had already spread several newspapers across his lap, though his eyes kept drifting to the window, watching England scroll past like pages in a book he'd read too many times before. 3 days, Watson murmured, settling into his seat with the resignation of a man who understood that comfort and train travel were only distant acquaintances. It seems rather a long way to go for what might prove to be simple village hysteria. Holmes folded his newspaper with precise creases, setting it aside. Perhaps. But consider, Watson, the logistics of the telegram itself. Our Count managed to send a message from one of the most remote regions of Transylvania, which suggests either remarkable determination or remarkable resources. Possibly both. And the phrasing, need rationality, implies a man who understands the nature of his predicament. He's not asking us to confirm the supernatural. He's asking us to disprove it. The train clattered over a bridge, and below them the Thames caught the weak morning light, turning briefly silver before fading back to its usual industrial grey. They were leaving London behind, that great engine of empire, heading toward something older, stranger, less certain. Watson watched his friend's profile against the window. Holmes had that look, the one that meant his mind was already racing ahead, constructing theories, discarding impossibilities, building careful scaffolding from fragments of information. It was exhausting to witness, and rather magnificent in its way, like watching a master pianist's fingers dance across keys, creating something complex and beautiful from simple black and white. The channel crossing at Dover was blessedly calm, the grey water rolling beneath their ferry with the gentle persistence of eternity. France received them with rain, soft, persistent rain that painted Paris in watercolours as they changed trains at the Gare de l'Est. The Orient Express proper awaited them there, that legendary train that carried diplomats and spies, opera singers and exiled royalty, all the fascinating detritus of a continent that couldn't quite decide whether it was rushing toward the future or clinging to its medieval past. Their new compartment was even more luxurious, all polished mahogany and crystal fixtures, with seats that converted to beds and windows dressed in silk curtains. A steward appeared with champagne and small pastries, speaking French with the practiced deference of a man accustomed to serving people who expected deference as their natural right. Holmes declined the champagne, but accepted coffee, thick, dark coffee that seemed to sharpen his already acute features. Watson took the champagne, reasoning that if one was going to travel across Europe toward an appointment with alleged vampirism, one might as well do so with some fortification. The train curved eastward, and France unfolded outside their window in shades of grey and green and brown. Villages clustered around church spires, their names like poetry: Epinay, Chalon, Nancy. Fields stretched toward horizons, bare now in November, waiting for spring with patient resignation. The rain continued, sometimes soft, sometimes insistent, tapping against the window glass like messages in code. Night fell somewhere between Strasbourg and Stuttgart, and the steward returned to convert their seats into sleeping berths, the compartment transforming with practiced efficiency into a small, comfortable cocoon. Watson lay in his berth, listening to the train's rhythm, feeling the gentle sway that was almost soothing once you surrendered to it. Above him, he could hear Holmes shifting occasionally, and he wondered if his friend slept at all, or simply lay there in the darkness, mind churning through possibilities. Morning brought Germany, ordered, efficient Germany with its neat farms and prosperous towns. They shared breakfast in the dining car, where white linens and silver cutlery attempted to maintain civilization despite the constant rocking motion. Holmes barely touched his eggs, but consumed 3 cups of coffee, reading a German newspaper he'd acquired at their brief stop in Munich, and occasionally muttering about Bavarian politics. "Did you know," Holmes said suddenly, looking up from his paper, "that vampire legends in Germany differ significantly from those in the Slavic regions? German vampires are generally seen as revenants, returned corpses driven by specific grievances. Slavic vampires, by contrast, are considered demons or possessed beings, capable of greater malevolence. The distinction matters when considering what sort of accusation our Count faces." Watson set down his toast. "You think the specific nature of the legend reveals something about the accusation?" "Everything reveals something, Watson. The question is whether we're attentive enough to see it." Holmes returned to his paper, but Watson caught the slight smile, the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had asked precisely the right question. The train climbed steadily through the afternoon, leaving the broad valleys behind for something more dramatic. The Alps appeared through the window like teeth, sharp, white, impossibly tall. Snow clung to their peaks even in November, and Watson felt a small thrill of something between fear and wonder. He'd seen mountains in Afghanistan, brown and brutal under relentless sun. But these were different. These were the mountains of fairy tales, the places where stories happened, where ordinary rules might not quite apply. Vienna welcomed them at dusk, the great Habsburg capital spreading along the Danube in imperial splendor. They had a 6-hour layover, and Holmes insisted they use it to stretch their legs and, as he put it, remind ourselves that civilization does exist, even at the edge of the unknown. They walked through streets that glowed with gaslight and ambition, past opera houses and palaces, past coffee houses where intellectuals argued about Freud's latest theories and whether the emperor was too old to properly govern. Vienna was where West met East, where German efficiency encountered Slavic passion, where a dozen languages competed for dominance in the marketplace. Holmes led them to a small cafe near St. Stephen's Cathedral, where he'd apparently visited before on some case Watson couldn't recall. They ordered sachatorte and coffee, and for an hour simply sat, watching Viennese life parade pass the window. Ladies in the latest fashions, soldiers in dress uniforms, students carrying books, all of them certain, or pretending to be certain, that the world made sense. "This is what we defend," Holmes said quietly, surprising Watson with the philosophical turn. "Not England specifically, but this. Order, reason, the belief that problems can be solved through observation and thought, rather than superstition and fear." Watson nodded, understanding. This was why Holmes did what he did. Not for fame or money, though both came readily enough, but because he genuinely believed in the power of rational thought to push back darkness. It was rather noble, when you stopped to consider it, though Holmes would be mortified to hear the word applied to himself. The night train from Vienna to Budapest was less luxurious, the compartments smaller, the other passengers more varied. They shared their car with a Hungarian merchant who spoke enthusiastically about the booming trade in agricultural equipment, and a Serbian Orthodox priest who said nothing but told his prayer beads with steady, patient fingers, the wooden beads clicking softly in rhythm with the rails. Watson slept poorly, waking several times as the train stopped at small stations whose names he couldn't pronounce. Each time he woke, he saw Holmes silhouetted against the window, watching the darkness slide past, and he wondered what his friend saw in those shadows, what patterns he was already constructing from insufficient data. Budapest at dawn was magnificent, the Danube splitting the city into Buda and Pest, bridges arching across like promises, the Parliament building rising in Gothic revival splendor that seemed both brand new and ancient. They had only an hour here before the next connection, barely time for breakfast and the purchase of a Hungarian newspaper that Holmes couldn't read but studied anyway, as if the shape of the letters might reveal secrets. The trains grew progressively less elegant as they moved eastward. The next leg took them through the Hungarian plains, the Puszta, flat and brown and endless, where villages appeared like islands in an ocean of earth. The other passengers changed too. Fewer businessmen and tourists now, more farmers and labourers, women in headscarves and men in rough wool coats, all of them carrying the particular weariness of people for whom train travel was necessity, rather than adventure. Holmes observed them all with his characteristic intensity, noting details that Watson could only guess at. The quality of someone's boots, the calluses on another's hands, the specific regional style of a woman's embroidered vest. each observation filed away, catalogued, ready to be retrieved when needed. The mountains began to reappear on the second day after Vienna, but these weren't the theatrical Alps. These were older, darker, more worn down by time. The Carpathians rose gradually, forest-covered slopes that climbed toward peaks hidden in perpetual mist. The trees were different here, darker pines mixed with bare deciduous branches that reached toward grey skies like supplicating arms. The villages they passed grew smaller, more isolated. Wooden houses with steep roofs to shed snow. Churches with distinctive onion domes painted in fading colours. Fields carved from forest, each one representing generations of labour to clear and maintain. This was the edge of empire, where Habsburg authority grew thin, where local custom still mattered more than Vienna's distant edicts. "We're entering another world," Watson said softly, watching a village disappear behind them, its houses already swallowed by mist. "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "A world where the 19th century sits uneasily atop the medieval. Where telegraph wires carry messages between villages that still believe in Strigoi and Moroi. Where Orthodox priests bless fields against demons, while agricultural reports from Vienna suggest improved ploughing techniques. It's a collision, Watson, between modernity and antiquity, and we're heading directly into the impact zone." The train slowed, climbing now, the engine labouring against gravity and altitude. Outside, the mist thickened, clinging to the trees like grey cotton. Watson could see why legends thrived here. This landscape seemed designed for mystery, for stories told around fires when the darkness pressed close. Even in daylight, what passed for daylight beneath the perpetual cloud cover, shadows pooled in hollows and gathered under trees, patient and waiting. They reached their final railway destination at Brasov as evening approached on their third day of travel. The town clung to the mountainside, its Saxon architecture incongruous against the wild Carpathian landscape. Red-tiled roofs, a Gothic church with a spire that pierced the mist, streets that climbed steeply, cobbled and narrow, designed for horses rather than the modern world. Holmes had arranged, via telegram from Vienna, for a carriage to meet them. The driver was waiting outside the small station, a grizzled Romanian with weather-carved features and eyes that assessed them with the frank curiosity of someone who didn't see many English gentlemen. His name was Nikolai, and his German was barely functional, but his horses were sturdy mountain breeds, shaggy and calm, built for difficult terrain. The carriage itself was old but well maintained, enclosed against the weather with leather curtains that could be drawn against wind and rain. Their luggage was secured with practiced efficiency, and within minutes they were climbing out of Brasov, heading north toward Magura, toward the village that feared its nobleman, toward whatever truth waited at the centre of this Gothic puzzle. The road, if it could be dignified with that term, wound through pine forests that pressed close on either side. The mist was thicker here, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 yards, turning trees into suggestions rather than certainties. The horses' hooves made soft, muffled sounds on the earth, and the carriage creaked with the particular music of wood and leather under strain. Watson pulled his coat tighter. Holmes had been right about the cold. This wasn't London's damp chill, which could be ameliorated with tea and a good fire. This was mountain cold, sharp and clean and unforgiving, the kind that found every gap in one's clothing and reminded you that nature didn't particularly care about human comfort. They'd been climbing for perhaps 2 hours when Nikolai called back to them in his rough German, pointing ahead. Watson leaned forward, peering through the mist, and saw lights, faint, golden, flickering. A village. Magura. The houses emerged gradually from the grey. Wooden structures with steep, shingled roofs and deep eaves. Small windows glowed with firelight, and smoke rose from chimneys, quickly absorbed by the encompassing mist. The village was larger than Watson had expected. Perhaps 200 souls clustered along a single main street, with smaller lanes branching off like nervous tributaries. And above, barely visible through the mist, perched on a hill that rose beyond the village like a watching presence, Watson could make out the dark silhouette of what could only be a castle. Towers, steep walls, narrow windows that caught the last grey light of evening and reflected nothing back. It looked, Watson thought with a slight chill, exactly like the castle from a Gothic novel, the place where terrible things happened, while virtuous heroines fainted and stalwart heroes arrived too late to prevent tragedy. "Our destination, I presume?" Holmes said dryly, following Watson's gaze. "Castle Draculecht, home to our client, the accused vampire. Rather on the nose, architecturally speaking." The carriage rolled down Magura's main street, and Watson became aware of faces at windows, watching them pass. Not friendly faces, not hostile exactly, but wary, suspicious. The way villagers everywhere regarded strangers who arrived asking questions. Doors closed as they passed. A woman hurried 3 children inside, her hand protective on the smallest one's shoulder. An old man standing outside what looked like a tavern or inn spat deliberately on the ground and turned away. "We're not welcome," Watson observed quietly. "Did you expect to be?" Holmes replied. "We're outsiders, arriving at the behest of the man they fear. To them, we're not detectives here to uncover truth. We're the vampire's allies, brought from the distant west to confuse and deceive. We'll need to be very careful, Watson. Fearful people are unpredictable people." The carriage stopped before a slightly larger building, 2 stories, with a painted sign showing a bear, or possibly a very large dog. The artistry was ambiguous. Nikolai climbed down and opened their door, gesturing toward the building. "Gasthaus," he said, exhausting his German vocabulary. "Sleep." Holmes paid him generously, adding extra coins until the man's weathered face cracked into something approaching a smile. Money, Watson reflected, spoke every language fluently. They gathered their bags and approached the inn. The door opened before they could knock, and a woman stood there, middle-aged, solid, wearing traditional dress with a white headscarf. Her face was carefully neutral, revealing nothing, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. "Herren," she said, her German heavily accented but functional. "Rooms, yes? You are the Englishman." It wasn't a question. Obviously their arrival had been anticipated, discussed, analysed before they'd even entered the village. "We are," Holmes confirmed. "Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson from London. We're here at the request of Count Draculecht." Something flickered across her face at the name. Fear or anger, or perhaps some complicated mixture of both. But she stepped back, allowing them to enter. "Rooms upstairs, dinner soon. You will want to rest, yes? Long journey." The inn's interior was dim, lit by oil lamps and a large fireplace where wood crackled and popped. The smell of smoke and cooking meat and unwashed bodies filled the space. Not unpleasant exactly, just different from London's particular perfumes. Several men sat at rough wooden tables, drinking from pewter mugs, and they all turned to stare as Holmes and Watson entered. The conversation, which had been a low rumble in Romanian, ceased entirely. Watson felt the weight of those stares, the assessment, the judgment. He'd felt it before in Afghanistan, entering villages where British soldiers were viewed with suspicion or hostility. The sensation was the same, being profoundly, uncomfortably foreign, every gesture subject to interpretation, every word potentially offensive, despite best intentions. Holmes seemed unbothered, nodding politely to the room at large before following the innkeeper's wife up narrow wooden stairs that creaked under their weight. The rooms she showed them were small but clean, each with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking either the street or, in Holmes's case, the castle above. "Dinner, 1 hour," she said, already turning to leave. Then she paused, looking back at them with an expression Watson couldn't quite read. "The Count," she said slowly. "He is. You should be careful. Very careful. Strange things happen near the castle. People see things, hear things. Maybe you should leave. Go back to England where you are safe." "Strange things such as?" Holmes asked gently. But she shook her head, making a gesture that might have been religious. Warding off evil, perhaps. 1 hour. Dinner. And she was gone, her footsteps rapid on the stairs, as if she regretted saying even that much. Watson moved to his window, looking out at the village below. Full darkness had fallen now, and the mist seemed to glow faintly with the light from scattered windows. Somewhere a dog barked, a lonely sound quickly muffled by the encompassing grey. And above, beyond and behind, the castle waited on its hill, dark against the dark sky, watching over the village that feared it. "Well," Watson said quietly, "we've arrived. Now the question is whether we'll discover a rational explanation or find ourselves in a Gothic novel with no clear path to the final chapter." Holmes joined him at the window, his sharp profile outlined against the faint light. "The explanation will be rational, Watson. It always is. The supernatural doesn't exist. Only people, with their entirely natural capacities for deception, fear, and self-delusion. Our task is simply to determine which combination of those entirely human qualities has resulted in a nobleman being accused of vampirism." He turned from the window, his eyes bright with that particular intensity that meant his mind was already working, already assembling pieces of a puzzle Watson couldn't yet see. "But I'll grant you this, the setting is rather magnificent in its Gothic excess. If one were going to stage an accusation of vampirism, one could hardly choose better than a Carpathian village in November, complete with castle, mist, and suspicious villagers. It's almost theatrical. Almost. Quite deliberately theatrical, I suspect. Which is itself a clue, Watson. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to construct this narrative. Tomorrow we begin dismantling it, piece by careful piece." Outside, the mist pressed closer, and somewhere in the village below, someone began to sing. A sad, minor-key melody that drifted up through the darkness like smoke, like memory, like all the old songs that have ever been sung in lonely places when night falls and the familiar world grows strange. The phantom of the Carpathian hills was waiting. But so, Watson thought with quiet confidence, was Sherlock Holmes. And that, he suspected, would make all the difference. Dawn arrived in Magura, not with light, but with a gradual lessening of darkness, as if the sun itself was reluctant to fully commit to this remote Carpathian village. Watson woke to the sound of roosters and distant church bells, their tones carrying that particular resonance of orthodox ritual, deeper, more mournful than the Church of England bells he knew from London. The air in his small room was cold enough that his breath misted, and frost had painted delicate patterns on the inside of his window glass, nature's own artwork in ice and silence. He dressed quickly, layering wool against the mountain chill, and descended the narrow stairs to find Holmes already in the common room, engaged in what appeared to be a careful negotiation with the innkeeper's wife. A plate of bread, cheese, and hard-boiled eggs sat before him, alongside a pot of something that smelled vaguely like coffee, but probably wasn't. Not in any sense a Londoner would recognize. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said, switching from his halting German to English with evident relief. "Mrs. Radulescu has been educating me about the village's recent troubles. Do join us." Mrs. Radulescu looked less pleased about this educational exchange, her round face set in lines of worry and something harder, resentment, perhaps, or fear, worn so long it had calcified into habitual suspicion. She wiped her hands on her apron repeatedly, a nervous gesture, as if trying to cleanse herself of the very conversation. Watson settled onto the wooden bench, accepting the plate she provided with a nod of thanks. The bread was dark and dense, the kind that stuck to your ribs and kept peasants working through long winter days. The cheese was sharp, pungent, made from sheep's milk, if he wasn't mistaken. Not unpleasant, just profoundly foreign in the way that food always marked one as a stranger in strange lands. "Mrs. Radulescu was just telling me," Holmes continued, his tone deliberately casual, "about the incidents that have troubled Magura these past months. Livestock deaths, strange lights near the castle, villagers seeing figures in the mist, all quite disturbing, I'm sure." The woman's hands stilled on her apron. She looked toward the door, as if checking for listeners, then leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Is not natural," she said, her German thick with accent. "Before the Count, he keep to himself, yes. Old family, old ways, but no trouble. Then, 3 months past, things change. Petru's best milk cow, dead in field. No marks, but all blood gone. Gone." She made a sucking gesture that was grotesquely explicit. "Blood gone entirely?" Holmes asked, his grey eyes sharp, despite the casual tone. "You're certain?" Petru cut the cow open himself, trying to understand. Empty, like wineskin. And more deaths after. Sheep. Goats. Always the same. No wounds you can see. But blood gone. And the Count. She crossed herself, a swift, nervous motion. People see him walking at night. Walking when good Christian people sleep. What does he do in darkness, eh? Why does he not stay in his castle like proper noblemen? Watson spread cheese on his bread, considering. Livestock deaths weren't unusual in rural areas. Disease, predators, accidents all took their toll. But deaths specifically characterized by blood loss, combined with sightings of the nobleman at night, would certainly feed superstitious fears in a community already primed to believe in vampires. The question was whether someone was deliberately feeding those fears, or if this was simply coincidence interpreted through the lens of folklore. "Has anyone approached the Count directly?" Watson asked. "Surely, if he's a reasonable man." Mrs. Radulescu's laugh was bitter, cut short. "Reasonable? He is boyar, old nobility. We are peasants. You think we walk to castle and knock on door like visiting neighbours?" She shook her head. "The priest, Father Alexei, he try. He go to castle, speak with Count. But Count sent him away. Say is all foolishness. Say to stop spreading fear. After that, she lowered her voice even further. Father Alexei becomes sick, very sick. 2 weeks he lay in bed, white like snow, weak like baby. He recover, but everyone know, everyone see. The Count punish him for speaking against him. Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, quick, communicative in the way that long partnership allowed. The priest's illness could be natural, could be dozens of things, but its timing was certainly convenient for maintaining a supernatural narrative. Either genuinely unfortunate coincidence, or someone had deliberately made the priest sick to reinforce the fear. But who? The Count himself, to maintain his isolation? Or someone else, someone who benefited from the village's terror? "We'll need to speak with Father Alexei," Holmes said, more to Watson than Mrs. Radulescu. "And with this Petru who lost his cow, and we should examine the sites where the animals died, though 3 months on, I doubt much evidence remains." "Evidence?" Mrs. Radulescu frowned. "What evidence you need? The Count is Strigoi. Everyone know this now. He must be stopped before more death comes, before he take not just animals, but people." She looked between them with something approaching pity. "You come from big city, yes? London, where everything is stone and train and science. You think you understand. But here, in mountains, old things still live. Old rules still matter. Science cannot explain everything, gentlemen. Some things are beyond your English understanding." Holmes smiled, that thin, controlled smile that meant he was being patient, despite finding the conversation somewhat tedious. "On the contrary, Mrs. Radulescu, I find that science explains everything quite adequately, once one has sufficient data. But I appreciate the warning. Now, if you could direct us to the path leading to Castle Draculest, we have an appointment with your Count." She stepped back, as if he'd announced an intention to walk into a dragon's lair, which, Watson supposed, was rather how she viewed it. "You go to Castle? Today? In daylight, yes. You go only in daylight." This seemed to be both question and plea. "In daylight," Holmes confirmed, rising from the table. "I assure you, Mrs. Radulescu, we'll be quite careful. Dr. Watson and I have faced considerably more dangerous situations than a conversation with a nobleman, regardless of what that nobleman might be accused of being." The path to the castle began at the northern edge of the village, marked by a weathered wooden cross that stood at the divergence of roads, one leading deeper into the mountains, presumably toward other villages, and the other climbing steeply toward the castle. The cross was old, its carved Christ figure worn smooth by weather and time, and someone had recently left offerings at its base: bread, salt, a small bouquet of dried herbs. Protection, Watson assumed, or perhaps appeasement of whatever forces were believed to inhabit these heights. The climb was steeper than it had appeared from the village, the path switching back on itself repeatedly as it ascended the hill. Pine trees crowded close, their branches heavy with mist that dripped steadily, creating a constant soft percussion. The air smelled of wet earth and resin, clean and sharp, so different from London's coal-tinged atmosphere that Watson felt almost dizzy with the freshness of it. Holmes climbed with his characteristic energy, seemingly unbothered by the altitude or the steep grade, occasionally pausing to examine something: a footprint in the soft earth, a broken branch, marks on a tree trunk that might have been anything or nothing. His mind was cataloguing, Watson knew, storing details for later correlation, building his understanding of this place piece by small piece. They'd been climbing perhaps 20 minutes when the trees suddenly opened, and Castle Draculest revealed itself properly for the first time. Watson stopped, breath catching not from exertion, but from the sheer Gothic drama of the scene before them. The castle rose from grey stone, built directly onto the hillside, so that in places the living rock became wall, and wall became rock. A seamless merger of natural and constructed. It wasn't large as castles went, perhaps 30 rooms at most, but what it lacked in size, it compensated for in sheer dramatic positioning. 3 towers of varying heights reached toward the low clouds, their conical roofs tiled in dark slate that gleamed wetly. Narrow windows, more like arrow slits in places, watched the approach with blank, unreadable faces. A wooden bridge spanned a small ravine where water rushed far below, the only access point Watson could see, easily defended, easily closed off. 15th century, mostly, Holmes observed, studying the architecture with professional interest. Built during the period of Ottoman conflicts, which explains the defensive positioning. That northeastern tower is earlier, though, probably 13th century, incorporated into the later construction. Interesting adaptation of Byzantine defensive principles to local terrain. Quite impressive, really, from a military architecture standpoint. Watson looked at his friend with mild exasperation. Holmes, we're approaching a castle where a man accused of vampirism lives, and you're admiring the architectural heritage? Why shouldn't I? The castle isn't supernatural, Watson. It's stone, mortar, and several centuries of weathering. Whatever mysteries wait inside are human mysteries, which makes them infinitely more interesting than any Gothic nonsense about the undead. Holmes started forward again, crossing the wooden bridge with confidence, despite the way it swayed slightly under their weight. The castle's main gate stood open, weathered oak reinforced with iron, scarred by age and use. Beyond it, a small courtyard paved in uneven stone spread before them, with the main building rising on 3 sides. On the 4th side, the cliff dropped away sharply, offering a view across the valley below, where Magura huddled in its protective mist, small and vulnerable from this height. A man stood waiting in the courtyard centre, hands clasped behind his back, posture erect, despite what Watson estimated to be 60 years at least. He wore dark clothes of good quality, but outdated cut, the fashion of perhaps 20 years ago, maintained carefully, probably the best he owned. His face was lean, aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a strong nose, clean-shaven in contrast to the bearded peasants of the village below. His hair, iron grey, was pulled back in an old-fashioned queue. But it was his eyes that caught Watson's attention, dark, intelligent, and carrying an expression of such profound weariness that it seemed almost like grief made permanent. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." His English was excellent, barely accented, the product of education and breeding. "I am Count Vasily Draculest. Thank you for making this long journey. I confess I half expected my telegram to be dismissed as the ravings of a madman. The phrase accused of vampirism does rather strain credibility in your modern age." Holmes stepped forward, extending his hand in greeting, a gesture that carried weight, Watson realized, accepting the Count as a man deserving of respect, rather than as a curiosity to be studied at arm's length. "Count Draculest, I assure you, I've investigated stranger claims, though I'll grant that few have required quite so dramatic a setting." The Count's handshake was firm, brief, and he allowed himself a small smile at Holmes's comment. "Yes, The castle does rather insist upon Gothic atmosphere, doesn't it? My ancestors built for defence, but they also built for psychological effect. A castle perched on a cliff communicates power, authority, separation from the common world below. Unfortunately, in the current circumstances, that separation has become isolation, and isolation has bred fear and suspicion. He turned to Watson, offering his hand. "Doctor, I'm grateful you've accompanied Mr. Holmes. If nothing else, your medical perspective may prove valuable. Please, come inside. I've had coffee prepared. Actual coffee. Not the local substitute made from roasted grain. One of the few advantages of noble blood is access to luxury goods, even at the edge of civilization." The castle's interior surprised Watson with its relative comfort. He'd expected dank stone corridors and medieval austerity, but while the architecture was certainly old, the furnishings were not. They entered a great hall with a massive fireplace where logs burned cheerfully, casting warm light across Turkish carpets and furniture that, while not fashionable, was well maintained and comfortable. Tapestries covered the stone walls, providing insulation against the cold, depicting hunting scenes and heraldic devices in faded colours. Books lined shelves along one wall, hundreds of volumes, their spines showing the wear of actual reading rather than decorative display. "My refuge," the Count said, noting Watson's survey of the room. 300 years of Draculesque history contained in these walls, and most of that history consisting of tedious agricultural records and petty disputes over grazing rights. We were never a powerful family, you understand. Minor nobility at best, holding this small region through force, faith, and fortunate marriages. But we held it, generation after generation, which is its own kind of achievement. He gestured toward chairs arranged near the fire, and a servant appeared, an old woman, silent and efficient, carrying a tray with coffee service. Real coffee, as promised, its aroma almost painfully civilized in this remote setting. She poured with practiced grace, then disappeared as quietly as she'd come, a ghost in the castle's familiar corridors. Holmes settled into his chair with the satisfied look of a man who'd found something interesting. "Tell us, Count, in your own words, how this situation developed. When did the accusations begin, and what specific form did they take?" The Count cradled his coffee cup, staring into the fire as if the flames might hold answers to questions he'd asked himself repeatedly. 3 months ago, as near as I can date it. Petru Ionescu's cow died. You'll have heard this already, I imagine. Village gossip travels faster than telegraph. The cow was old, perhaps 8 years, and died in the field one night. Petru found it at dawn, and because he found no obvious cause of death, he chose to interpret the death superstitiously, rather than naturally. "The blood," Holmes prompted. Mrs. Radulescu mentioned the blood was gone. "So Petru claims. I cannot verify or dispute his claim, as I wasn't present and certainly wasn't invited to examine the carcass. But I can tell you that livestock die, Mr. Holmes. They die of age, disease, accident, predation. The fact that Petru couldn't immediately identify the cause doesn't mean the cause was supernatural. It means only that Petru is a farmer, not a veterinarian, and his diagnostic capabilities are limited to his experience." Watson sipped his coffee. It was excellent, rich and strong, and asked, "But why would he immediately assume vampirism? Surely there are more prosaic explanations that would occur first." The Count's smile was bitter. "You forget, Doctor, where you are. This isn't London. where superstition has been mostly relegated to parlour entertainment and Gothic novels. This is Transylvania, where the Orthodox Church maintains considerable influence, where education is limited, where the old beliefs run deep as the mountains themselves. My family name doesn't help matters. Draculecht, Holmes said thoughtfully, derived from Dracul, the dragon or the devil, depending on context and pronunciation, related to the Order of the Dragon, presumably. 15th century alliance against Ottoman expansion. You've done your research, yes, an ancestor, distantly related to the more famous Vlad Dracul, bore the dragon title with pride. But in local memory, that glory has transformed into something darker. Dracul becomes demon, dragon becomes devil. And old stories tell of men who made pacts with darkness to gain power, who became strigoi after death, rising from graves to torment the living. When livestock began dying, when I made the mistake of walking abroad at night, it was easy, too easy, to revive those old associations. You walk at night frequently? Watson asked. I do. The Count's voice carried defiance, mixed with sadness. I suffer from insomnia, Doctor, a condition I've endured for years. When sleep eludes me, I walk, through the castle, sometimes along the paths outside. I find the night peaceful, the solitude conducive to thought. But to the villagers watching from below, seeing lights in the castle at strange hours, occasionally glimpsing a figure on the ramparts, these nocturnal habits become evidence of supernatural nature. A good Christian sleeps at night. Therefore, one who walks in darkness must be ungodly. The logic is medieval, but persistent. Holmes set down his cup and leaned forward, his expression intent. Let's be precise about timeline. The cow died 3 months ago. What happened next? More deaths over the following weeks. 3 sheep belonging to different families. A goat. A dog that had been known to chase chickens, possibly poisoned by an irritated neighbour, but attributed to me. Each death reinforced the narrative. Then Father Alexei came to speak with me 2 months ago. Mrs. Radulescu mentioned he became ill. He did. After visiting here, questioning me about the deaths, suggesting, diplomatically, that perhaps I should leave the region for a time to allow tensions to ease. I refused, naturally. This is my home, my family's home. I've committed no crime, supernatural or otherwise. I will not be driven from my own castle by superstitious fear. The Count's voice had hardened, pride and anger surfacing. A week after his visit, Father Alexei took to his bed with some fever. He recovered, but the timing was interpreted as confirmation. The Count punishes those who speak against him. Therefore the Count must be strigoi. What actually caused the priest's illness? Watson asked, his medical interest piqued. I have no idea, Doctor. I didn't cause it. I can assure you of that. But I cannot prove a negative. I cannot demonstrate that I didn't somehow curse him or drain his vitality or whatever supernatural mechanism the villagers imagine. That's the particular horror of these accusations. They exist beyond the reach of evidence or reason. How does one prove one isn't a vampire? It's like proving one doesn't have invisible servants or cannot fly. The absence of evidence becomes, perversely, evidence of absence of evidence, which the fearful interpret as cleverness rather than innocence. Holmes stood and began to pace, a habit Watson recognized as the sign of his mind working through complexities. You mentioned lights seen in the castle at unusual hours. Do you have any explanation for those beyond your own nocturnal wanderings? The Count hesitated, and Watson saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or embarrassment. I've taken to conducting certain experiments. Scientific experiments, I should clarify, not occult rituals, though I imagine the distinction is lost on the villagers. I have a laboratory of sorts in the Eastern Tower, where I pursue certain interests in chemistry and natural philosophy. When sleep eludes me, I sometimes work there. The processes I employ occasionally produce light, phosphorescent reactions, combustion experiments, that sort of thing. Nothing supernatural, but certainly dramatic when viewed from below through mist and prejudice. "May we see this laboratory?" Holmes asked immediately, his interest clearly captured. "Of course. Though I warn you, my equipment is somewhat makeshift, my methodology probably appalling by rigorous scientific standards. I'm an amateur enthusiast, not a trained researcher." The Count rose, setting aside his coffee. "The Eastern Tower is this way. Mind the stairs. They're steep and somewhat worn. The castle may look romantic from a distance, but living here is a constant battle against decay, damp, and the simple entropy that claims all human constructions given sufficient time." He led them through corridors that grew progressively colder and darker, the tapestries giving way to bare stone, the carpets ending where function superseded comfort. They climbed a spiral staircase carved from the living rock, worn smooth by centuries of feet, narrow enough that Watson's shoulders nearly brushed both walls, higher and higher, until Watson's legs burned and his breath came short, the altitude combining with exertion to remind him he was 50 years old, and perhaps not as fit as he'd been in his army days. Finally, they emerged into a circular room at the tower's top, and Watson stopped, surprised despite himself. The space was part laboratory, part library, part observatory. A telescope stood at one window, pointed toward the mountains. Tables held chemical apparatus, beakers, retorts, glass tubing, arranged with the careful precision of someone who knew their use. Books were stacked everywhere, many open, marked with slips of paper. Notes covered the walls, written in several languages Watson couldn't identify. And along one wall, phosphorescent minerals glowed faintly even in daylight, arranged in careful rows, labelled in careful script. "My sanctuary," the Count said softly. "Here at least I can pursue knowledge without interference. Chemistry, astronomy, mineralogy, whatever captures my interest. It's a poor substitute for true scientific community, but when one is isolated by geography and, increasingly, by fear, one makes do with what resources are available." Holmes moved immediately to the chemical apparatus, examining it with the keen interest of a fellow practitioner. "Phosphorescent compounds," he murmured, noting the materials. "You're studying luminescence? Interesting. And these notes? You're recording observations systematically. This is quite respectable work, Count Draculesht." The Count's pleasure at the compliment was evident and touching. "Thank you. I've tried to maintain proper methodology. It's difficult without access to scientific journals or collaboration, but I subscribe to several publications from Vienna and Berlin when the post manages to reach me. My research is modest, but it occupies my mind, gives purpose to the sleepless hours." Watson joined them at the table, noting the careful drawings of chemical structures, the logged experiments with their outcomes. This was the work of an educated, curious mind, trapped by circumstance in a remote location, pursuing knowledge as a refuge against loneliness. It was rather sad, really, and made the Count's situation feel more tragic than threatening. "On nights when you cannot sleep," Holmes said, "you come here and work, Sometimes your experiments produce light. Phosphorescence, flame, luminescent reactions. Someone in the village sees lights in the tower at midnight, 3 in the morning, pre-dawn hours. They tell others. The story grows with each retelling. The Count performs dark rituals. The Count conjures demons. The Count is not human. Precisely, the Count said wearily. I am guilty only of insomnia and intellectual curiosity. But in a fearful community, those become evidence of evil. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, how does one prove one's humanity when humanity itself is in question? How does one demonstrate innocence when the very accusation places one beyond the reach of normal proof? Holmes turned from the laboratory table, his grey eyes thoughtful. By finding the truth beneath the fear, Count Draculesht. By discovering what's really killing the livestock, what actually made the priest ill, who benefits from maintaining this supernatural narrative. Someone does, I assure you. Fear is always useful to someone. Our task is to determine who that someone is and expose them. The Count looked at Holmes with an expression Watson recognized. Hope mixed with skepticism. The look of a man who'd been disappointed before, and didn't dare believe that disappointment might end. You truly think this can be resolved rationally? That evidence and logic can overcome generations of superstition? I know it can, Holmes said, with the absolute confidence of someone whose entire world-view rested on that foundation. The supernatural doesn't exist, Count. Only the natural, sometimes deliberately obscured. And nothing hidden can remain so under sufficient scrutiny. Outside, the mist pressed against the tower windows, and far below, the village of Magura huddled in its fear. But here in the eastern tower, surrounded by books and beakers and the careful work of an educated mind, Watson felt the first stirring of understanding. This wasn't a story about vampires. It was a story about isolation and fear, about the collision between old beliefs and modern knowledge, about a man trapped between two worlds, nobility without power, education without community, curiosity without collaboration. And somewhere in that complicated web of circumstance and superstition, there was truth waiting to be uncovered. Holmes had promised to find it, and Watson had learned, over years of partnership, that when Sherlock Holmes made such promises, they were rarely broken. The game, indeed, was afoot. The descent from the eastern tower left Watson's legs trembling with exertion, though he tried not to show it. Pride, he reflected, was a curious thing, perfectly willing to climb endless stone stairs to avoid appearing weak, even when no one particularly cared about one's physical condition except oneself. Holmes moved with his usual elastic energy, apparently unbothered by altitude or exercise, his mind clearly already racing ahead toward the next phase of investigation. Count Draculesht led them back to the great hall, where the fire had been built up and a light lunch laid out. Bread, cheese, cold meat, pickled vegetables, the substantial fare of mountain people who understood that warmth and calories were necessities, not luxuries. The old servant woman who'd brought coffee earlier moved about silently, replenishing plates, her face carefully blank, but her eyes watchful. Watson wondered what she thought of all this. Her master accused of vampirism, 2 English detectives arrived to investigate. Did she believe the accusations, fear her employer, or simply endure, as servants had endured for centuries, keeping her thoughts private and her position secure? I should like, Holmes said, settling into his chair with a plate balanced on his knee, to examine the sites where the livestock died. I assume the carcasses are long gone, but the locations themselves may prove informative. And I'd like to speak with the villagers who found the animals, Petru Ionescu particularly, since his was the first incident. The Count nodded slowly, though his expression suggested doubt. You're welcome to try, though I warn you, the villagers are unlikely to be forthcoming. I'm the enemy in their narrative, and you're my allies. That makes you suspect by association. But Father Alexei might speak with you. He's educated, been to seminary in Sibiu, understands the difference between superstition and faith. He recovered his health, though the experience clearly shook him. The timing of his illness troubles me, Watson interjected, spreading sharp cheese on dark bread. 2 weeks of fever following his visit here. What symptoms exactly? Weakness, you mentioned? Pallor? Anything else? You'd have to ask him directly, Doctor. I only know what village gossip conveyed, filtered through fear and embellishment. He couldn't eat, supposedly. Couldn't keep down food or water. Lost considerable weight. The description, I admit, does have unfortunate parallels to certain vampire legend elements. The victim slowly drained of vitality, wasting away. But correlation isn't causation, as I'm sure you'd agree. Holmes set down his plate, his meal barely touched. Food was always secondary to thought for him, a necessary inconvenience. I'd like to spend tonight observing the castle and its surroundings. You mentioned walking at night. Would you be willing to maintain your usual routine? If someone is deliberately creating supernatural incidents, they may do so again, and observation might prove illuminating. You want to watch for the phantom, the Count said, something that might have been bitter amusement in his voice. Very well. I warn you, November nights in the Carpathians are not pleasant. The cold cuts through wool like water through cloth. But if you're determined, I can provide you with furs and a vantage point on the western rampart that overlooks both the village and the surrounding forest. Excellent. Watson, you should rest this afternoon. We may have a long, cold night ahead. Holmes stood, already moving toward the window, drawn by something outside. Count, that forest to the north, does it connect to the village lands? And the stream I heard from the bridge, where does it flow? The Count joined him at the window, pointing out features of the landscape that were barely visible through the persistent mist. The forest is mixed holdings, some mine, technically, some common land, where villagers have traditional rights to gather wood and forage. The stream flows down from the mountains, passes below the castle, eventually reaches the valley floor and joins the larger river near Brasov. In spring, when the snow melts, it becomes quite dramatic. In November, it's merely cold and persistent. Watson finished his lunch, listening to them discuss topography and property boundaries, the conversation technical and detailed. Holmes was mapping the terrain in his mind, Watson knew, storing every detail for later correlation. Where could someone approach unseen? Where might livestock be vulnerable? What natural features might be exploited to create mysterious effects? All of it data, waiting to be assembled into understanding. The afternoon passed quietly. The Count retreated to his library to attend to correspondence, leaving Holmes and Watson to explore the castle at their leisure. They wandered through rooms that spoke of faded grandeur, a formal dining hall with a table that could seat 20, now shrouded in dust covers, a music room with a pianoforte whose ivory keys had yellowed with age, bedrooms furnished in styles ranging from Baroque to vaguely modern, most clearly unused for years. The castle was too large for one man and one elderly servant, Watson reflected. It demanded a family, guests, life. Instead, it held only echoes and the particular sadness of spaces meant for community occupied by solitude. "He's lonely," Watson observed as they stood in what had once been a nursery, now empty except for a rocking horse with a missing eye and paint flaking from its wooden flanks. Isolated by geography, by social position, by his own inclinations toward study rather than society. The villagers fear him, and that fear has calcified into hatred. He has no peers here, no friends, no family, only books and chemicals and the endless Carpathian mist. Loneliness, Holmes said, is often the price of intelligence in provincial settings. Those who think differently become suspect. Those who pursue knowledge rather than tradition become threatening. The Count is caught between worlds, too educated for the village, too isolated for proper society. And now someone is exploiting that isolation, using it to destroy what little connection he has with the people whose lands surround his own. "You think someone is deliberately orchestrating this?" "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that fear, this organized, this persistent, this specifically directed, rarely occurs spontaneously. Someone is feeding it, whether through actual incidents or through careful manipulation of natural events. The question is, who benefits from the Count's destruction? Who gains if he's driven from the castle or killed by mob violence?" Watson considered. The land, perhaps. If he dies without heirs, the property would revert to whom exactly? The Emperor? Local authority? Worth investigating. Also worth asking who owes him money, who has disputes with him, who might want access to the castle or its contents. The motive may be prosaic: property, debt, old grievances. But the method is theatrical. Use the village's existing superstitions to accomplish entirely worldly goals. Holmes moved to the nursery window, looking out toward the village below. Fear is remarkably efficient. It requires no evidence, generates its own momentum, and once established, becomes almost impossible to dislodge through reason alone. Whoever conceived this scheme understands human psychology quite well. They returned to the great hall as afternoon faded toward evening. The Count emerged from his library looking tired, the weariness in his face more pronounced. He'd changed into heavier clothes against the night's cold. Wool trousers, a thick shirt, a coat lined with fur that had seen considerable wear. "Sunset comes early in the mountains," he observed, noting the dimming light. "By 5 o'clock, we're in twilight. By 6, full darkness. The villagers will be securing their animals, barring their doors, hanging garlic and holy symbols. They do this every night now, have done for 2 months, exhausting to live in perpetual fear, but they seem unable to stop, unable to consider that the threat they fear doesn't exist." Holmes had also changed, layering wool and accepting a heavy fur coat that smelled of age and storage and the particular musk of whatever animal had contributed its pelt. "Tell me about the property disputes you mentioned earlier. Who has traditional rights in the forest? Are those rights clearly defined or subject to interpretation?" The Count settled into his chair with a sigh. "Traditional rights are never clearly defined, Mr. Holmes. That's rather the point. They're based on custom, memory, assertion, and counter-assertion. The villagers claim rights to gather wood, to pasture pigs on forest mast, to collect mushrooms and herbs. I claim ownership of the land itself. Neither claim is absolute, neither is entirely groundless. We've coexisted in this ambiguity for generations, but—" He paused, choosing words carefully. There has been pressure lately to formalize arrangements. The Habsburg administration is modernizing, surveying lands, establishing clear titles, converting traditional rights into legal contracts. "And you've been resistant to this modernization?" Watson asked. "Not resistant exactly, cautious. Once rights are written down, they become fixed. What's generous in custom may become limiting in law. What's ambiguous can become absolute. I've been negotiating with village representatives, or trying to. The process has been contentious." Holmes leaned forward, interest sharpening. "Contentious how? Who represents the village in these negotiations?" "Primarily 3 men. Petru Ionescu, the farmer whose cow died first. Ion Stancu, who owns the mill and serves as unofficial village headman. And Father Alexei, who mediates disputes and carries moral authority. We've been meeting intermittently for 6 months, trying to draft an agreement acceptable to all parties. The negotiations were proceeding slowly but civilly until—" he gestured helplessly, "until the deaths began. After that, the meetings stopped. No one will come to the castle. No one will speak with me except through intermediaries, and those reluctantly. So the vampire accusations effectively ended negotiations that were, presumably, moving toward some resolution." Holmes stood, beginning to pace. "Tell me, in those negotiations, were you winning or losing? Would the final agreement have favored you or the village?" The Count considered. "Neither, I'd hoped. I was seeking compromise, formalize some rights, maintain others as traditional, establish clear boundaries while preserving flexibility. But Petru was pushing for maximum village rights with minimum obligations. He wanted access to all forest lands, wanted to reduce my share of mill revenues, wanted to eliminate certain feudal dues that, while small, still technically apply. We were at an impasse, actually. The negotiations had stalled. And then his cow died, and he had a perfect excuse to abandon negotiation entirely," Holmes said softly. "Moreover, he gained a weapon, fear, that could potentially drive you from the castle altogether, leaving the lands effectively under village control, regardless of legal niceties. Quite convenient." Watson saw where Holmes was leading. "You think Petru killed his own cow? To create the vampire panic?" "I think it's worth considering. A man who stands to gain substantially from ending negotiations might find creative ways to do so. But we're speculating without data. Tonight's observation may prove illuminating. Count, when you walk at night, do you follow regular routes, predictable patterns?" "Somewhat. I walk the ramparts, sometimes descend to the forest path, occasionally visit the old chapel in the woods. It's on castle grounds, built by an ancestor. Now ruins, but still peaceful. Why?" "Because," Holmes said, "if someone is creating supernatural incidents, they need to know where you'll be and when. Predictability enables theatrical effects. We'll need to be less predictable tonight. Vary the pattern. Watch for watchers. Watson, you'll take the western rampart with the Count. I'll position myself in the forest below, observing approaches. If anything interesting occurs, I'll be in position to intercept." The old servant woman brought them an early dinner, stew thick with meat and root vegetables, hot and nourishing, designed for people facing cold nights. They ate mostly in silence, Holmes absorbed in thought, the Count in visible apprehension, Watson in that peculiar mental state before action, alert, focused, the old soldier's readiness that never entirely faded despite years away from warfare. Night fell with mountain swiftness. the last grey light extinguished, like a candle snuffed. The temperature dropped precipitously, and Watson was grateful for the heavy furs as they climbed to the western rampart. The Count carried a hooded lantern, its light carefully shielded, and Watson had his revolver, checked and loaded, tucked in his coat pocket. Holmes had vanished into the darkness below, moving with the silence that had always seemed slightly uncanny, as if he could simply will himself to become invisible. The rampart was perhaps 5 feet wide, bordered by crenellations that offered some protection from wind and concealment for observation. The stone was cold enough that Watson could feel it through his gloves when he steadied himself against the wall. Below, the village lights glimmered faintly, oil lamps and candles behind shuttered windows, the church's windows showing the warm glow of perpetual candles before icons. Beyond, the forest was absolute darkness, the trees invisible except where they block stars, creating negative spaces against the sky. "This is my nightly world," the Count said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Darkness, cold, solitude. I know every stone of these walls, every irregularity. I can walk them blind, and often do when the mist is thick. Out here, at least, I feel something. Not quite peace, but clarity perhaps. The problems of daylight seem smaller when one stands beneath the stars, remembering that all human concerns are temporary against geological time." Watson understood. He'd felt similar things in Afghanistan, on watch during cold desert nights, when the universe's indifference became oddly comforting rather than threatening. "How long have you lived alone here?" "My parents died when I was 20, 12 years ago. An influenza outbreak. They were both gone within a week of each other. I inherited the castle and the responsibilities and the isolation. I'd hoped to marry, establish a family, fill these empty rooms with life and noise and children. But—" he gestured toward the darkness below. "Who would marry the strange nobleman in his remote castle? The village girls are forbidden to speak with me. The families of my social class are in Vienna, Budapest, distant places where I'm an oddity at best. So I've remained alone, growing stranger with each passing year, until now even the pretense of connection has been severed by fear." A sound drifted up from below, something between a howl and a wail, rising and falling, utterly unhuman. Watson's hand went instinctively to his revolver, and beside him the Count stiffened. "Wolf," the Count said after a moment. "They come down from the high mountains in winter, following deer and chamois. The villagers believe I control them, naturally, that they're my servants, or my transformed self. They're simply animals, hunting, surviving, no more supernatural than sheep or cattle." The howl came again, closer now, joined by others. A pack, Watson realized, multiple voices harmonizing in that eerie chorus that had terrified humans since humanity's first nights in caves. Beautiful and terrible simultaneously, a reminder that nature existed entirely apart from human concerns, pursuing its own rhythms regardless of belief or fear. Movement below caught Watson's eye, a light, flickering, moving through the forest. Not the steady glow of a lantern, but something more erratic, appearing and disappearing, now green-tinged, now blue, dancing between trees like something alive and malicious. "Do you see that?" Watson whispered urgently, pointing. The Count followed his gesture, tension radiating from him. "Yes, this is what they see, the phantom lights. I've observed them before, but never determined their source. They appear perhaps twice a week, always in the forest, always moving, always that strange color. They're what convinced the villagers I'm conjuring demons." Watson watched the light bob and weave, trying to judge its height, its speed, whether it followed paths or moved randomly through undergrowth. It was perhaps 8 feet off the ground, moving at walking pace, clearly under someone's control, despite its erratic appearance. Not supernatural then, but deliberately created to appear so. "Holmes is down there," Watson murmured, more to himself than the Count. "If anyone can discover the source, it's him." They watched in tense silence as the light continued its dance, now approaching the castle, now retreating toward the village, now circling as if searching for something. The wolves howled again, their voices surrounding the forest, coming from multiple directions. The effect was profoundly unsettling, the strange light, the wild calls, the darkness pressing close. Watson understood viscerally how villagers, seeing this from their windows, would interpret it as supernatural. Every instinct screamed danger, threat, otherness. Then, abruptly, the light vanished, simply gone, as if it had never existed. The forest returned to unbroken darkness, and even the wolves fell silent, as if whatever had disturbed them had passed. Watson and the Count remained motionless, watching, waiting. Minutes stretched, each one feeling longer than the last. Watson's hands were numb with cold, despite his gloves, and his breath created clouds that dispersed immediately into the larger mist. A low whistle came from below, 3 notes descending. Holmes's signal. Watson responded with 2 notes, acknowledging. Then they waited for his return, knowing he'd found something, but unable to ask what, until he rejoined them. When Holmes finally appeared in the castle courtyard 20 minutes later, his coat was covered in pine needles, and his face showed the particular satisfaction of someone who'd confirmed a hypothesis. He gestured for them to return to the great hall, and they descended from the ramparts gratefully. Watson's legs protesting the stairs, but his mind alert with anticipation. In the warmth of the hall, with the fire rebuilt and brandy poured, Holmes finally spoke, laying several objects on the table like a conjurer revealing his tricks. A glass vial, stoppered with cork, a length of thin wire, a fragment of phosphorescent mineral, and a piece of cloth, stained with something that glowed faintly even in the firelight. "Your phantom," Holmes announced, "is entirely human and remarkably clever. The lights are created using phosphorescent compounds, likely calcium sulfide mixed with strontium for the green color, copper compounds for blue. The material is painted onto cloth or suspended in solution, then attached to a pole or staff. Wave it about in darkness, and it creates exactly the effect we witnessed. Mysterious lights that appear and disappear, moving through the forest as if alive." The Count stared at the objects. Someone is doing this deliberately, creating false supernatural incidents? Not merely creating them, but staging them with considerable sophistication. Look at this wire. It's used to create a pulley system in the trees, allowing the light to be raised and lowered, to move along fixed paths while appearing to float freely. And the timing is careful, always on moonless nights, always when mist provides maximum atmospheric effect, always when you're known to be awake and moving about the castle. Someone is watching your patterns and scheduling their performances accordingly. Watson examined the glowing cloth. But who? And can you prove it? I tracked the light to its source, a clearing about 300 yards from the castle walls. Whoever was operating it fled when I approached, but they left these items behind in their haste. Tomorrow, will examine the clearing in daylight, look for footprints, dropped items, any evidence that might identify our theatrical phantom. But I can tell you this much. Whoever is doing this has access to chemical supplies, understands basic principles of luminescence, and has been surveying the forest to identify optimal staging locations. That considerably narrows our suspect list. The Count had gone very still, staring at the evidence on the table. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something Watson hadn't seen before. Not just hope, but anger, righteous and burning. Someone has been destroying my reputation, terrorizing the village, isolating me deliberately, using their ignorance and fear as weapons. And they've done so with calculated precision, using my own scientific interests against me, creating false mysteries designed to confirm the villagers' worst superstitions. Precisely, Holmes agreed. This isn't spontaneous panic, Count Draculest. It's orchestrated persecution. And tomorrow we begin identifying the orchestra conductor. Outside, the wolves howled again, their voices carrying across the dark valley. But here in the castle's great hall, surrounded by evidence and reason and the warm glow of firelight, Watson felt the mystery beginning to crack, revealing the human machinery beneath the supernatural facade. The phantom had been seen. Now it would be unmasked. And Watson suspected that when they finally revealed the truth, it would prove to be exactly as Holmes had predicted. Not monsters or demons or creatures of legend, but simply people with their entirely natural capacities for cruelty, greed, and deception. The game was progressing, and Sherlock Holmes was winning. Dawn brought no dramatic revelation of sunlight, merely a gradual shift from black to grey, as if the Carpathian mountains themselves were reluctant to fully embrace daylight. Watson woke stiff from the narrow bed and cold that had seeped through blankets during the night, his breath still misting in the unheated bedroom. The castle's stone walls, so impressive from outside, proved remarkably porous when it came to retaining warmth, and he dressed quickly, layering wool with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd served in Afghanistan and learned that cold, like enemy fire, was best met with preparation rather than complaint. He found Holmes already awake, or perhaps still awake. It was sometimes difficult to tell, standing at the great hall window with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. His friend's face showed the particular intensity that meant his mind had been working through the night, assembling pieces, testing theories, discarding impossibilities with the ruthless efficiency of a master craftsman selecting tools. "The clearing," Holmes said without preamble, not turning from the window. "We need to examine it in daylight before weather or wildlife disturbs whatever evidence remains. The Count has agreed to guide us. He knows the forest paths, which will save considerable time. And afterward, we speak with the villagers. Petru Ionescu first, I think. The man whose cow died so conveniently." Watson joined him at the window, accepting coffee from the ever-present servant woman who materialized with the silence of a ghost and the efficiency of long practice. Below, the village was stirring, smoke rising from chimneys, figures moving between buildings, the ordinary business of rural life proceeding despite the extraordinary fears that gripped the community. From this height, Magura looked almost peaceful, a collection of wooden structures nestled in the valleys. Protection, surrounded by forest and mountains that had stood long before the village existed and would stand long after it crumbled to dust. "You think Petru is our phantom?" Watson asked quietly. I think he has motive and opportunity. Whether he has the knowledge to create phosphorescent compounds is another question, but chemical supplies can be purchased or stolen, and the technique isn't particularly complex for someone with basic education. We'll need to search carefully for evidence linking him specifically to the incidents, but yes, he's our primary suspect, a man who stands to gain substantially from driving the Count from his lands. The Count appeared a few minutes later, dressed for outdoor work in heavy boots and a coat that had seen considerable wear. His face looked haggard in the morning light, the sleepless night evident in the shadows under his eyes and the deeper lines around his mouth. But there was something else too, a kind of grim determination, the look of a man who'd lived too long under accusation and finally saw the possibility of vindication. "Ready?" he asked, and at Holmes's nod, led them out through the castle's main gate and down a path that diverged from the main approach. This trail was narrower, less maintained, winding through forest that pressed close on both sides. Pine branches hung low, occasionally brushing their shoulders, depositing cold water from the night's mist. The ground was soft with centuries of accumulated needles, muffling their footsteps, and the air smelled of resin and earth, and the particular dampness of mountain forests in November. They walked in silence for perhaps 15 minutes, the Count moving with the confidence of someone who knew every root and stone. Watson followed, his medical bag slung over one shoulder out of habit. One never knew when injury or illness might require attention, and his hand occasionally checking the reassuring weight of his revolver in his coat pocket. Holmes moved like a hunting dog on scent, his sharp eyes cataloguing everything, his mind clearly working through possibilities. The clearing, when they reached it, was perhaps 30 feet in diameter, roughly circular, with a flat rock at its center that looked like it might have served some purpose once. Altar, meeting place, boundary marker. The trees surrounding it were older than average, their trunks thick, their branches creating a canopy overhead that would block rain, and, more importantly for theatrical purposes, would make the space invisible from above, while leaving it open enough for movement and manipulation. Holmes immediately began a systematic search, moving in a widening spiral from the rock outward, occasionally dropping to his hands and knees to examine something at ground level. The Count and Watson stood back, knowing better than to disturb his process, watching as he worked with that peculiar combination of intensity and patience that characterized his methods. "Here," Holmes said, after perhaps 10 minutes, pointing to the ground near the clearing's eastern edge. Footprints, partially obscured by pine needles, but still visible. 2 sets, possibly 3. And look, he indicated a tree trunk. Marks where rope or wire was tied, probably to create the pulley system I mentioned. Recently done, the bark is still fresh where it was abraded. Watson joined him, crouching to examine the footprints. They were indeed visible, once you knew to look. Impressions in the soft earth showing boots, one set noticeably larger than the others. "Can you determine anything about who made them?" "Working man's boots," Holmes murmured, using a small ruler from his pocket to measure the impressions. "Worn soles, local manufacture probably. This larger set shows a slight drag of the right foot, old injury perhaps, or simply fatigue affecting gait. And here," he pointed to marks in the earth. "Something was dragged, a sack or bundle, heavy enough to leave a trail. The phosphorescent materials, most likely being transported to and from the site. The Count was examining the tree trunk, running his fingers over the abraded bark. "This tree is on my land, definitely within the castle boundaries. Whoever did this was trespassing. Not that traditional right-of-way makes much legal distinction in these parts, but it proves they were operating deliberately on my property, close enough to the castle to be observed from the ramparts, but far enough to remain concealed during preparation." Holmes continued his examination, occasionally making notes in the small book he always carried, his handwriting cramped and nearly illegible to anyone but himself. He collected samples, pine needles from specific locations, scraping from the tree bark, a small clump of earth containing part of a footprint, all of it carefully wrapped and labelled, evidence to be analysed later, possibly correlated with materials found elsewhere. "The sophistication bothers me," Holmes said, straightening. "Creating phosphorescent compounds requires knowledge, materials, and time. It's not something a simple farmer would undertake casually. Either our perpetrator has education we haven't accounted for, or they're working with someone who does." "Watson, your thoughts on the priest's illness. Could it have been induced artificially?" Watson considered, calling up his medical training. "Possibly. The symptoms described, weakness, inability to eat, pallor, prolonged fever, could result from various toxins. Arsenic, for instance, or certain plant-based poisons. Dosage would be critical, enough to produce dramatic illness without actually killing. It would require some medical or chemical knowledge, but not necessarily extensive. Folk medicine in these regions includes considerable understanding of toxic plants, passed down through generations. So our phantom might also be a poisoner, Holmes mused. That adds another dimension. Someone with knowledge of chemistry and toxicology, or access to someone who possesses such knowledge. Count, who in the village has education beyond basic literacy? Who might have chemical knowledge or medical training? The Count frowned, thinking. Father Alexei attended seminary, 4 years of education including some natural philosophy. The teacher, Maria Popescu, was trained in Brasov, probably has secondary education. Ion Stancu, the miller, learned his trade in Sibiu, would have some practical knowledge of mechanics and weights. Petru. No formal education that I know of, though he's clever enough in his way. But his daughter, Anna, she's perhaps 18, went to the convent school for 2 years. Unusual for a peasant girl, but Petru had ambitions for her. The daughter, Holmes said sharply. Interesting. Young enough to be influenced, educated enough to be useful. Tell me about Anna Ionescu. I barely know her. She helps her father with the farm, occasionally works at the inn. Quiet girl, or so I've been told. After her mother died, 3 years ago, she took over the household. Why? Holmes didn't answer directly, but Watson saw the calculation in his eyes, the pieces rearranging into new patterns. A daughter educated beyond her station, loyal to a father with ambitions, young enough to be fearless in ways that older, more cautious people might not be. It was speculative, certainly, but it opened possibilities. They returned to the castle by a different route, Holmes insisting on surveying as much of the forest as possible, noting paths and clearings, streams and rock formations. He was mapping the terrain comprehensively, Watson realized, understanding the physical space where these supernatural dramas had been staged. Knowledge was power in Holmes's world, and geographical knowledge was often the difference between theory and proof. Back at the castle, they found the Count's servant woman had prepared a substantial breakfast: eggs, ham, fresh bread, strong coffee. They ate while Holmes outlined his plan for the day, speaking around mouthfuls of food with the unself-conscious practicality of someone who viewed eating as fuel rather than pleasure. Watson and I will visit the village this afternoon. We'll speak with Petru, examine the site where his cow died if possible, observe the household dynamics. Count, you should remain here. Your presence would only make the villagers defensive. Can you provide us with something official-looking? A letter of introduction, perhaps, establishing us as investigators acting in the interest of Habsburg authority? It might encourage cooperation. The Count nodded. I'll draft something. Though I warn you, Habsburg authority is viewed with considerable ambivalence here. The empire is distant, its rules often incomprehensible or inconvenient. Local custom tends to supersede imperial law in practical matters. Nevertheless, the appearance of official sanction may prove useful. Holmes finished his coffee and stood. Also, I'll need access to your laboratory again. I want to analyze these samples from the clearing. Compare them with any chemical supplies you have. See if there's overlap that might suggest theft or borrowing. They spent the morning in the eastern tower. Holmes conducting experiments with the focus of someone who'd found his natural element. He mixed compounds, compared phosphorescent reactions, made careful notes in his cramped handwriting. Watson watched, occasionally handing him equipment, more interested in the process than the specific results. This was Holmes at his best, methodical, patient, letting the evidence speak rather than forcing it to confirm preconceived theories. The Count worked at a smaller table nearby, drafting and redrafting his letter of introduction, seeking the right tone, authoritative enough to command respect, humble enough to avoid seeming like imperial imposition. It was a difficult balance, Watson reflected, managing the politics of a region where old feudal relationships coexisted uneasily with modern administrative structures. The phosphorescent materials used in the clearing, Holmes announced after perhaps 2 hours of work, are not from your supplies, Count. The composition is similar, but not identical. Different ratios, different preparation methods. Whoever created them had access to raw materials and basic chemical knowledge, but wasn't working from your specific formulations. That suggests independent preparation or purchase from a supply house, possibly in Brasov or even Cluj. So I'm cleared of creating the lights myself? The Count asked with weary humour. You were never seriously suspected of that particular aspect. The question was whether someone was using your materials without your knowledge or bringing their own. The answer is clearly the latter, which supports deliberate orchestration rather than opportunistic exploitation of available resources. By early afternoon, Watson and Holmes were ready to descend to the village. The Count provided them with his letter, sealed with his family crest pressed into red wax, lending it appropriate gravitas. He also gave them directions to Petru Ionescu's farm, which lay on the village's northern edge, closest to the forest and the castle above. Be careful, the Count said as they prepared to leave. The villagers aren't violent by nature, but fear makes people unpredictable. If they perceive you as genuinely threatening, if they believe you're helping the vampire they fear. He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear enough. Watson touched the revolver in his pocket, taking comfort from its weight. We'll be careful. We're Englishmen conducting an investigation, nothing more threatening than that. The descent to Magura took less time than the ascent had, gravity assisting their steps. The village appeared different in daylight, less ominous, more simply poor. The houses, which had seemed mysterious in mist and darkness, revealed themselves as practical, structures built for survival rather than beauty. Steep roofs to shed snow, small windows to conserve heat. Wooden construction because stone required money and skill that these peasants lacked. It was a village built by people whose primary relationship with the world was struggle. Against weather, against hunger, against the simple, relentless difficulty of extracting life from mountain soil. They found Petru Ionescu's farm by following the Count's directions and their noses, the unmistakable smell of livestock and manure announcing agricultural activity. The farmyard was larger than Watson had expected, well maintained, with a substantial barn and several outbuildings, suggesting prosperity beyond mere subsistence. Chickens scratched in the yard. A dog chained near the house barked their arrival with more enthusiasm than menace. Petru himself emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on rough trousers, his face registering surprise and suspicion in equal measure. He was perhaps 50, solidly built, with the weathered features of someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, assessing them with the frank calculation of a man who understood that strangers meant either opportunity or threat, and was prepared to respond to either. Holmes stepped forward, removing his hat in polite greeting. "Mr. Ionescu, I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We've come from London at the request of Count Draculest to investigate the unusual incidents that have troubled Magura these recent months. We have a letter from the Count explaining our purpose, if you'd care to examine it." He offered the sealed letter, and Petru took it with evident reluctance, breaking the seal and studying the contents. His lips moved slightly as he read. Literate, then, which was somewhat unusual for a peasant farmer, though perhaps his ambitions for his daughter's education reflected his own past schooling. When he finished, he looked up, his expression unchanged. "The Count sent you to prove he is not Strigoi," Petru said, his German functional but heavily accented. "Why should I help him? Why should any of us? We know what we know. We see what we see." "And what exactly have you seen?" Watson asked gently, adopting the bedside manner he'd developed over years of medical practice, calm, sympathetic, non-judgmental. "We'd like to understand, to hear directly from you what's been happening. The deaths, the strange occurrences, all of it. We're not here to dismiss your concerns, Mr. Ionescu. We're here to find the truth." Petru studied them both, clearly debating whether to speak or send them away. Finally, he gestured toward the house. "Come, we talk inside. The day is cold, and—" he glanced around as if checking for observers. "His better neighbours not see me speaking with the vampire's English friends." The house's interior was dim, but surprisingly comfortable. A large stove radiated heat from one corner. Rough furniture, homemade but sturdy, filled the single main room. Icons hung on the walls. Orthodox saints, with their characteristic flat, stylized features, painted on wood, surrounded by dried flowers and small candles. A loom stood near the window, half-completed cloth stretched across its frame. This was a working household, Watson realized, every space utilized, nothing wasted or purely decorative. A young woman appeared from what must have been a sleeping room. Anna, presumably Petru's daughter. She was perhaps 18, as the Count had estimated, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that held the same sharp intelligence as her father's. She wore traditional dress, embroidered vest over a white blouse, layered skirts, but something in her bearing suggested education, awareness beyond the village's limited horizon. "My daughter, Anna," Petru said. "She speaks German better than I do. Went to convent school in Brasov. Smart girl." Pride coloured his voice, unmistakable, despite his gruff tone. Anna nodded acknowledgement, but said nothing, moving to the stove where a pot simmered, filling the room with the smell of cooking cabbage and onions. She stirred it mechanically, but Watson noticed her attention was clearly on them, listening even as she feigned domestic distraction. Holmes settled onto the bench Petru indicated, Watson beside him. "Tell us about your cow," Holmes said. "The one that died 3 months ago. Walk us through exactly what happened, from the moment you last saw it alive to when you found it dead." Petru's face darkened with memory and anger. "Was my best milk cow. 8 years old, still producing well. I put her in the field at dusk, as always. Good pasture, close to the house. In the morning, I go to bring her for milking, and she is there, lying on her side, dead. No sound in the night, no struggle I hear. Just dead." "And you examined the body?" Holmes prompted. "Of course I examine. I am farmer, not fool. I look for wounds, for signs of predator attack. Nothing. No marks, no blood on the ground, nothing. But when I cut her open—" He paused, and Watson saw genuine fear flicker across his face. "Empty. The blood, all the blood, gone. Like something drain it completely, drink it all. You understand? No blood at all. Not natural, not possible by any normal way." Watson leaned forward. "As a doctor, I can tell you there are several conditions that might explain apparent loss of blood. Internal hemorrhaging that settles in specific locations, making other areas appear bloodless. Certain diseases that affect blood consistency. Even post-mortem changes that—" "No," Petru interrupted firmly. "I know animals, doctor. I slaughter for meat. I know what dead animals should look like inside. This was different, wrong. And after, more deaths. Always the same. No wounds you see, but blood gone. And always after we see the lights in the forest, hear the wolves howling, know the Count walks his walls at night like demon surveying his hunting ground." Holmes had been studying Petru's face during this recitation, and Watson knew that look. His friend was reading micro-expressions, noting hesitations, cataloguing the difference between genuine fear and performed emotion. What he concluded, Watson couldn't yet tell, but something was registering, being filed away for later analysis. "These lights in the forest," Holmes said casually. "Have you seen them yourself? Directly, I mean, not heard about them from others?" Petru hesitated fractionally, barely perceptible, but Watson caught it and knew Holmes had too. "I see them, yes. Twice. Green lights, blue lights, moving between trees like they are alive. Dancing lights, spirit lights. Everyone see them now. Is common. And they always appear near the castle. Never on the far side of the village, never in areas distant from Count Draculeshti's lands." Another hesitation. They are where the vampire's power is strongest. Near his castle, near his lands. This makes sense, yes. Holmes smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression, more the look of a hunter who just confirmed his prey's location. It makes sense if one accepts supernatural causation. Less sense if one considers geography, property boundaries, and the theatrical requirements of creating convincing, mysterious lights. "Tell me, Mr. Ionescu, Do you have any chemical knowledge? Any understanding of phosphorescent compounds, luminescent reactions, that sort of thing? The question hung in the air like a sword, and Watson saw multiple reactions flicker across Petru's face: surprise, indignation, and something else, something that might have been fear or guilt, before his expression closed down entirely, becoming carefully neutral. "I am farmer," Petru said flatly. "I know soil, animals, weather, not chemicals, not science. Why you ask this? Simple curiosity. Someone with chemical knowledge could create lights that appear supernatural, but are actually quite mundane, just as someone with knowledge of toxicology could make a man ill in ways that mimic vampiric attack. Just as someone with strong motivation might find creative ways to turn village superstition into a weapon against an opponent in property negotiations." The accusation was implicit, but unmistakable. Petru stood abruptly, his face darkening with anger. Genuine or performed, Watson still couldn't tell. "You accuse me? You say I kill my own cow, make false lights, hurt Father Alexei, all to... what? Trick my own village? For what purpose?" "To end negotiations with the Count," Holmes said calmly. "Not rising, not backing down. Negotiations that were not proceeding in your favor. To gain control of forest lands and mill revenues without having to compromise. To drive the Count from his castle and claim the territory without legal challenges. Fear is remarkably efficient for achieving political goals, Mr. Ionescu, and you would benefit substantially from the Count's departure." Anna had stopped stirring the pot, frozen at the stove. Her face showed shock, and something else, Watson thought. Knowledge, perhaps, complicity. She knew something, certainly, though whether she was participant or simply aware was unclear. Petru's hand moved to his belt, where Watson belatedly noticed he carried a large knife, probably used for farm work, but dangerous nonetheless. Watson's hand went to his pocket, to the revolver, ready, but not yet drawing it. The moment balanced precariously, violence possible but not inevitable. Then Anna spoke, her German clear and precise, educated. "Father, don't. They don't understand. They come from cities where everything is explained, where mystery doesn't exist. They cannot understand what we live with, what we fear. Sending them away won't help. The Count will simply send others, or the authorities will come, and then—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear enough. Then things would become official, legal, beyond the village's ability to control. Petru's hand moved away from the knife. He looked at his daughter with an expression Watson couldn't quite read. Pride, worry, love, and something more complex. A recognition of her intelligence that both pleased and troubled him. "You should leave," Petru said to Holmes and Watson, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Go back to the castle, to your vampire Count. Tell him we will not be bullied, not by him, not by English detectives with their science and their accusations. We know what we know. And if he does not leave our lands, if he continues to hunt in darkness, to spread his evil, we will deal with him ourselves, in the old way, the way that works when law and reason fail." The threat was explicit, and Watson stood slowly, his hand still near his revolver. This was how lynch mobs began. Fear combined with frustration, superstition armed with righteous anger. They needed to leave before the situation escalated, but they also needed to convey that they'd learned something, that the investigation was proceeding regardless of village cooperation or threats. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Ionescu," Holmes said, rising with deliberate calm. "We'll continue our investigation. And I'll give you one piece of advice. Whoever is creating those forest lights should stop immediately. We have physical evidence now, and it's only a matter of time before we trace it to its source. Confession and cooperation will be viewed more favorably than continued deception and eventual exposure. He moved toward the door, Watson following, both of them keeping their attention on Patru without obviously watching him. Anna stood by the stove, her face pale, her hands gripping the spoon so tightly her knuckles showed white. She looked at Watson as they passed, and in that brief moment he saw something in her eyes, plea perhaps, or warning, or simply the trapped desperation of someone caught between loyalty and knowledge. Outside, the afternoon had grown colder, the sky darker with approaching weather. They walked quickly back toward the castle path, neither speaking until they were well clear of the farmhouse, and certain they weren't being followed. "Well," Watson said finally, "that went poorly." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, his voice light with satisfaction. "It went excellently. We now know that Patru is involved, that his daughter likely knows details she's reluctant to share, and that we're close enough to the truth to provoke threats rather than mere denials. Progress, Watson. Definite progress." Progress toward what? A mob storming the castle? Violence? Progress toward resolution. And yes, possibly toward violence, which is why we need to move quickly. Tomorrow we speak with Father Alexei and examine his illness more carefully. Then we need to search Petru's property, legally difficult, but possibly necessary. And we need to win Anna's cooperation. She's the weak point in their conspiracy, if conspiracy it is. Young enough to be frightened by consequences, educated enough to understand the seriousness of false accusation, and clearly troubled by what's been happening. They climbed back toward the castle as the first snow began to fall, tiny flakes that dissolved almost immediately, but promised heavier accumulation to come. Winter was arriving in the Carpathians, and with it, Watson feared, a crisis that might end in revelation or violence or both. The phantom had been glimpsed. Now they needed to unmask it completely, before fear turned deadly and superstition claimed lives in the name of protection. The game was reaching its critical phase, and Watson only hoped they could solve the puzzle before it solved them, permanently. The snow fell more heavily as evening approached, transforming the Carpathian landscape into something from a Gothic fairy tale, the castle towers becoming ghostly silhouettes against the darkening sky, the forest below disappearing beneath a white veil that muffled sound and obscured vision. Watson stood at the great hall window, watching the transformation with the unease of someone who understood that beauty and danger often wore the same face. Snow meant isolation, meant the village would be even more cut off, meant that if violence erupted, assistance would be impossible. Holmes paced behind him, restless energy barely contained, his mind clearly working through the day's revelations and planning the next moves in this increasingly dangerous game. The Count sat near the fire, staring into the flames, with the expression of a man who'd lived too long under siege and was approaching either surrender or desperate action. Watson couldn't tell which, and that uncertainty troubled him. "We need Father Alexei," Holmes said abruptly, stopping mid-pace. "His illness is the key element that transformed village suspicion into certainty. If we can prove it was artificially induced, demonstrate the method and possibly the perpetrator, we undermine the entire supernatural narrative. Count, can you arrange for him to visit the castle? Would he come?" The Count looked up from the fire, considering. Perhaps. He's a reasonable man, educated, not entirely ruled by superstition despite his profession. And his illness frightened him, not just the physical symptoms, but the implications. If we can offer him answers, explanations that don't require believing he was cursed by a vampire. He trailed off, then nodded decisively. I'll send a message. Whether he responds is another matter, but I can try. The message was dispatched with the elderly servant woman, who bundled herself against the snow and descended toward the village with the steady determination of someone who'd walked these paths through far worse weather. Watson watched her go, a small dark figure against the white landscape, and felt a pang of admiration for these mountain people who endured conditions that would defeat softer city dwellers within days. While they waited, Holmes returned to the Eastern Tower laboratory, insisting Watson accompany him. I want to test a theory about the priest's illness, he explained, climbing the narrow stairs with his characteristic energy. If it was poisoning, certain substances would produce the described symptoms, and if those substances are accessible locally, we narrow our suspect list considerably. The laboratory was cold, despite a small brazier the Count had lit earlier, the circular room feeling exposed to the elements at this height. Holmes moved immediately to the bookshelves, pulling down volumes on toxicology and local flora, flipping through pages with the speed of someone who could absorb information at a glance. Here, he said, finding something and turning the book so Watson could see. The page showed a detailed botanical illustration of a plant with distinctive leaves and small flowers. Aconitum, monkshood, wolfsbane, grows throughout these mountains, used traditionally in hunting to poison arrow tips. The roots contain aconitine, which in sufficient doses causes precisely the symptoms Father Alexei experienced: weakness, nausea, inability to eat, pallor, prolonged recovery time, and it's readily available to anyone who knows where to look. Watson studied the illustration, his medical training providing context. Dosage would be critical. Too much would kill, too little would have minimal effect. Someone would need knowledge of preparation and administration, or access to someone with that knowledge. Rural midwives and healers often maintain sophisticated understanding of medicinal and toxic plants. That knowledge, misapplied, becomes weapon rather than cure. Holmes set the book aside, moving to another shelf. The question is whether we can prove Father Alexei was poisoned with aconitine specifically, and if so, whether we can trace the source to Petru or his household. His daughter, Watson said quietly. Anna. She attended convent school. Nuns often teach herbalism, medicinal preparations. She would have had education in exactly the sort of plant knowledge required. Holmes turned, his grey eyes sharp with interest. Yes, and she was clearly distressed during our visit, clearly conflicted. Loyalty to her father versus understanding of the seriousness of what's been done. If we can separate her from Petru's influence, convince her that a confession is safer than continued complicity. He left the thought unfinished, but Watson understood. They descended back to the great hall as darkness completed its conquest of the afternoon. The Count had ordered dinner prepared, roasted venison from the castle's own hunting, root vegetables, dark bread, wine from some family reserve that had probably been aging since before Watson was born. They ate with better appetite than the situation warranted, the body's practical demands overriding the mind's anxieties. The servant woman returned as they were finishing, stamping snow from her boots and unwinding layers of wool. She spoke briefly with the Count in Romanian, her weathered face expressionless, then withdrew to the kitchen. The Count looked at Holmes and Watson with something approaching hope. "Father Alexei will come," he announced, "tomorrow morning, after conducting services. He's curious about your presence, apparently. English detectives investigating vampirism. He wants to hear your theories, understand what rational explanation you might offer for what he experienced." "Excellent," Holmes said with satisfaction. "That gives us tonight to prepare our presentation. Watson, I'll need your medical expertise to explain aconitine poisoning in terms a layman can understand. We need Father Alexei convinced not just intellectually, but emotionally. Convinced enough to potentially testify against whoever administered the poison." The evening passed in preparation. Holmes assembled his evidence, the phosphorescent materials from the clearing, his chemical analysis, maps showing the locations of incidents in relation to Petru's property. Watson prepared notes on aconitine poisoning, symptoms, dosage, recovery timeline. Everything needed to demonstrate that natural causes could explain supernatural effects. The Count provided background on village politics, property disputes, the specific points of contention in the failed negotiations with Petru. By midnight, they had constructed a comprehensive case, not yet proof sufficient for legal proceedings, but certainly enough to create reasonable doubt about supernatural causation. The question remained whether reasonable doubt would be sufficient in a community where belief ran deeper than reason, where centuries of folklore carried more weight than modern evidence. Watson retired to his small bedroom, but slept poorly, waking repeatedly to the sound of wind driving snow against the windows and the deeper, more unsettling sounds of the castle itself. Creaks and groans as stone contracted in the cold, the whisper of draughts through corridors, the occasional thump of snow sliding from roofs. Old buildings had their own language, he reflected, their own ways of complaining about age and weather, and the simple burden of standing upright through centuries. Dawn came reluctantly, grey light filtering through snow-laden clouds. Watson dressed and descended to find Holmes already awake, or still awake, it was impossible to tell, standing at the window with his violin, playing something slow and melancholic that seemed to echo the mountain landscape's desolate beauty. The Count sat nearby, listening, his face showing an appreciation that suggested music was one of many civilized pleasures his isolation had largely denied him. "Morning, Watson," Holmes said, without pausing his playing. "Father Alexei should arrive within the hour. The Count has ordered the great hall prepared for our presentation. I thought a degree of formality might lend appropriate weight to the proceedings. We're not merely chatting about theories. We're offering definitive explanation for phenomena that have terrorized an entire community." The priest arrived as predicted, escorted by the servant woman who delivered the message. Father Alexei was younger than Watson had expected, perhaps 40, with a full dark beard going grey at the edges and intelligent eyes that assessed them with frank curiosity. He wore the black robes of an Orthodox priest, a large silver cross hanging on his chest, and moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd been seriously ill and remained conscious of physical vulnerability. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." His German was excellent, his voice carrying the particular resonance of someone trained in public speaking. "I confess your presence in Magura has created considerable discussion. English detectives, investigating claims of vampirism on behalf of the accused vampire himself, It's quite unprecedented." Holmes gestured toward chairs arranged before the fireplace. "Please, Father, sit. Can we offer you coffee, tea? We appreciate your willingness to visit despite the weather and the complicated circumstances." Father Alexei settled into the offered chair, accepting coffee with a nod of thanks. "I come seeking understanding, Mr. Holmes. I experienced something 2 months ago that shook my faith, not in God, but in my ability to distinguish spiritual truth from physical manipulation. I was ill, genuinely ill, weak as a newborn for 2 weeks. And the illness came immediately after I confronted Count Draculest about the village's fears. The timing was impossible to ignore, and many in the village interpreted it as proof of supernatural retaliation. "But you have doubts," Watson said gently, settling into his own chair and adopting the sympathetic physician's manner that had served him well over decades of practice. "Otherwise you wouldn't be here." The priest's expression showed something between relief and shame. "I do, because during my illness, even in my weakest moments, I never felt cursed. I felt sick, naturally sick, as if from disease or poison rather than spiritual attack. But admitting those doubts to my congregation would be seen as weakness, as failing to believe in the very spiritual realities I'm ordained to represent. So I've remained silent, allowed the vampire interpretation to persist, and felt increasingly complicit in a narrative I'm not certain is true." Holmes leaned forward, his intensity focused, but not aggressive. "Father Alexei, how did your illness begin? Walk us through the first symptoms, the progression, everything you remember." The priest closed his eyes, clearly marshalling memories he'd perhaps tried to suppress. "The day after visiting the castle, I began feeling nauseated. By evening, I couldn't keep down food or water. Severe weakness followed. I could barely stand. My heart raced irregularly. I felt cold, desperately cold, even near the fire. The symptoms intensified over 3 days, then plateaued. I remained weak, barely able to perform my duties, for nearly 2 weeks before gradually recovering." Watson was already nodding, recognition sparking. "And during the acute phase, the first 3 days, did you experience any numbness, tingling in your extremities, difficulty breathing?" Father Alexei's eyes opened, surprise evident. "Yes, all of that. My fingers and toes felt numb, as if frozen, and breathing was difficult, required conscious effort." "How did you know?" Watson glanced at Holmes, who nodded permission to proceed. "Because those symptoms, taken together, are characteristic of aconitine poisoning, monkshood, wolfsbane, a plant common throughout these mountains, used traditionally in hunting, and, occasionally, in medicine at very carefully controlled doses. In larger amounts, it produces exactly what you experienced, and the timing of recovery, approximately 2 weeks, matches aconitine's metabolic clearance from the body." The priest had gone very still, his coffee forgotten in his hand. "Poisoning? You're saying someone poisoned me deliberately? But how? I ate nothing unusual, drank nothing that—" He stopped, memory clearly surfacing. "Wait. After visiting the castle, I stopped at Petru Ionescu's farm. He offered me tea, traditional hospitality. I thought nothing of it, drank it gratefully. It was cold that day. The tea was warming." "And Petru would have had opportunity to prepare the tea with aconitine extract mixed in," Holmes said quietly. "The bitter taste of the poison masked by strong tea, honey perhaps, spices. A calculated dose, enough to make you dramatically ill, not quite enough to kill. The timing ensured that villagers would connect your illness to your confrontation with the Count, reinforcing the supernatural narrative Petru was constructing. Father Alexei set down his coffee cup with a hand that trembled slightly. Why? Why would Petru do such a thing? He's ambitious, yes, aggressive in protecting his interests, but to poison a priest? To win a property dispute, the Count said from his position near the fire. We were negotiating forest rights, mill revenues, various feudal obligations that persist in ambiguous legal limbo. Petru wanted maximum rights with minimum obligations. I was seeking compromise. The negotiations had reached an impasse. Then his cow died, possibly naturally, possibly not, and he saw opportunity. Create a vampire panic, drive me from the castle, claim the lands without legal challenges. Your illness was simply one element in a broader strategy of manipulation through fear. Holmes rose and moved to the table, where he'd arranged his evidence. Let me show you what we've discovered. He held up the vial containing phosphorescent material. This was recovered from a clearing in the forest where mysterious lights have been observed. Not supernatural lights, Father, but deliberately created ones. Phosphorescent compounds painted on cloth, manipulated using pulleys and poles to create the illusion of spirits moving through trees. Theatrical effects designed to terrify observers predisposed to supernatural interpretation. He laid out additional evidence, piece by piece. The wire fragments, footprint measurements, chemical analysis, maps showing incident locations. The presentation was methodical, comprehensive, building toward inevitable conclusion. Watson watched Father Alexei's face throughout, seeing intellectual conviction war with emotional resistance. This was a man whose worldview was being simultaneously validated and challenged. His illness explained naturally, but his community's fears revealed as manipulation rather than genuine spiritual threat. The livestock deaths, Father Alexei asked quietly, were those also staged? Some possibly natural, some possibly deliberately killed, and the blood drained post-mortem to simulate vampiric attack. We haven't yet examined the sites thoroughly, but the pattern of incidents, all on properties of Petru's allies, all timed to reinforce the growing panic, suggests coordination rather than random supernatural predation. The priest stood, moving to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. When he spoke, his voice carried deep weariness. I believe you. God forgive me, but I believe you. And if I believe you, I must act. The village is prepared to take matters into their own hands, Mr. Holmes. There's talk of coming to the castle in force, of dealing with Count Draculest in the old way, stake and fire. I've tried to counsel patience, to suggest we wait for proper authorities, but fear is stronger than my counsel. If we cannot stop this soon, violence becomes inevitable. Then help us, Holmes said intently. Return to the village. Speak with Anna Ionescu privately. Petru's daughter. She's conflicted, clearly troubled by what's been done. She has education, understands consequences that her father may be blind to. Convince her to confess what she knows, testified how the poison was prepared and administered. With her testimony and our physical evidence, we can break Petru's conspiracy and end this panic before it turns deadly. Father Alexei turned from the window, his expression showing the resolve of someone who'd made a difficult decision. I'll try. Anna is a good girl at heart, intelligent, devout. She confesses regularly, and I've noticed reluctance recently, burden she carries. If she understands that remaining silent makes her complicit in potential murder, not of a vampire, but of an innocent man, her conscience may overcome her fear. "We need her by tomorrow night," Holmes said. "That's our timeline. Petru knows we're investigating, knows we're close to exposing him. He'll either escalate or try to eliminate the threat. Either scenario likely involves violence. We need to preempt it with truth, with evidence sufficient to create reasonable doubt even among the most fearful villagers." The priest nodded, accepting the urgency. "Tomorrow night. I'll do what I can. And Mr. Holmes, thank you for giving me back the ability to trust my own perceptions, to believe that faith and reason need not be enemies. That's worth considerable risk." After Father Alexei departed, trudging back through snow that was now nearly a foot deep, the three men remaining in the castle looked at each other with the grim awareness that they'd reached the critical phase. Everything now depended on whether a young woman's conscience would prove stronger than her loyalty, whether truth would arrive before violence, whether reason could triumph over centuries of superstition. "We should prepare for the worst," Watson said practically. "If Petru suspects Father Alexei is turning against him, if he realizes we're building a case that exposes his conspiracy, he may act precipitously. The castle's defensible, but we're only 3 people, one of them not trained in combat, and the village's number in the hundreds." Holmes finished the thought. "Yes, which is why we need a backup plan. Count, is there any way to summon Habsburg authorities, imperial police, military garrison, anyone with legal authority to intervene?" The Count shook his head. "The nearest garrison is in Brasov, 3 hours away in good weather. Impossible to reach in this snow. Telegraph lines don't extend to Magura. We're too remote, too economically insignificant. We're isolated gentlemen, which is both our vulnerability and, possibly, our protection. The villagers fear me, but also respect tradition. They may threaten, but actually executing a nobleman carries enormous risk. Legal, spiritual, practical. Empty threats are safer than action that might bring imperial retaliation." "Don't bet your life on that calculation," Watson said quietly. "Mobs rarely think through consequences. Fear drives them, and fear makes people capable of anything." The day wore on in tense preparation. Holmes conducted another search of the forest clearing, looking for additional evidence, anything that might strengthen their case. Watson checked his revolver, ensured adequate ammunition, prepared his medical supplies for potential casualties. The Count organized the castle's defenses, such as they were. Gates that could be barred, windows that could be shuttered, supplies sufficient for a siege, though hopefully it wouldn't come to that. Evening brought no word from the village, no sign of Father Alexei's progress. Snow continued falling, building drifts against the castle walls, transforming the landscape into something pristine and treacherous. Watson stood watch on the western rampart, wrapped in furs, watching the village lights below like distant stars, wondering what conversations were happening in those warm rooms, whether truth was gaining ground or fear cementing its hold. Night fell, and still no word. They retired to the great hall, keeping vigil, waiting. The fire burned low, the wind howled around the towers, and somewhere in the village below, a young woman wrestled with conscience, deciding whether to speak truth or maintain silence, whether to save an innocent man or protect her guilty father. The phantom had been unmasked intellectually. Now came the harder task, convincing others to see what reason had revealed, to abandon comfortable fear for uncomfortable truth. Watson touched his revolver again, taking cold comfort from its weight. Tomorrow would bring resolution, one way or another. Either reason would triumph, or violence would erupt, or some complicated mixture of both would unfold in ways impossible to predict. The game was in its final phase, and the outcome remained desperately uncertain. Outside, the wolves howled in the darkness, their voices carrying across the snow-covered valley. But whether they sang of danger or merely of winter's indifferent arrival, Watson couldn't tell. He could only wait and watch and hope that dawn would bring answers rather than disaster. Morning arrived with unexpected clarity. The snow had stopped during the night, and pale sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time since Watson and Holmes had arrived in Transylvania. The light transformed the landscape, making the white-covered mountains glitter like something from a cathedral's stained glass, beautiful and cold and utterly indifferent to human drama. Watson stood at the great hall window, watching the village below begin to stir. Smoke rising from chimneys, figures moving between buildings, ordinary life proceeding despite the extraordinary tensions that gripped the community. Holmes appeared beside him, looking uncharacteristically rumpled, evidence that he'd actually slept, rather than simply paced through the night. "Today," he said quietly, "we'll have our answer. Either Ana Ionescu will come forward, or Petru will make his move. The waiting is nearly over, Watson, for better or worse." The Count joined them, carrying coffee that steamed in the cold air. His face showed the lines of sleepless worry. But there was something else too, a kind of grim acceptance, the look of a man who'd carried burden too long, and was almost relieved to finally reach crisis, regardless of outcome. "Whatever happens," he said, "I'm grateful you came. Even if this ends badly, at least I'll know the truth. At least I'll die understanding that I was destroyed by human malice, rather than my own supernatural nature. That's worth something." "No one is dying," Watson said firmly, his hand unconsciously checking his revolver's position. "We're three intelligent men with evidence, reason, and sufficient defensive position. The village may threaten, but actually storming a castle in deep snow requires more organization and commitment than fear alone provides." They were finishing breakfast when the servant woman appeared, her weathered face showing unusual animation. She spoke rapidly in Romanian, gesturing toward the window, and the Count set down his coffee with sudden intensity. "Someone is coming from the village," he translated. "A single figure, walking alone. The woman can't tell who from this distance." They moved to the window, watching the figure climb the snow-covered path with slow determination. As it approached, details emerged. Small stature, wrapped in shawls and heavy skirt, moving with the careful steps of someone unaccustomed to deep snow. A woman. And as she drew nearer, Watson recognized the dark hair, the bearing that suggested education and consciousness of purpose. "Ana Ionescu," Holmes said with quiet satisfaction. "She's come. Father Alexei succeeded." They waited in tense silence as she completed the climb, crossed the wooden bridge, entered the castle courtyard. The Count went to greet her personally, a gesture of respect that Watson noted, treating her as an honored guest rather than a peasant supplicant. When she entered the great hall moments later, escorted by the Count, Watson saw her face clearly for the first time in good light. Young, yes, but with the kind of maturity that comes from responsibility assumed too early, from being the woman of a household before one is quite ready. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, her expression showing fear and determination in equal measure. "Miss Ionescu," Holmes said gently, indicating a chair near the fire. "Thank you for coming. I know this required courage. Please, sit. You're safe here. I promise you that. Whatever you tell us will be used only to prevent further harm, not to pursue punishment beyond what justice requires." She settled into the chair with visible relief, accepting the tea the Count offered, her hands wrapping around the cup, as if seeking warmth or comfort, or simply something solid to hold. When she spoke, her German was clear, educated, confirming what Watson had suspected about convent schooling. "Father Alexei spoke with me last night," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "He told me what you discovered, what you believe happened, and he asked me to think about my immortal soul, about whether remaining silent about sin makes one complicit in that sin. I didn't sleep. I prayed, I thought, I wrestled with loyalty and truth, and I realized—" She paused, tears spilling. "I realized that protecting my father from consequences of his actions isn't loyalty. It's enabling evil, and I cannot do that, not even for him." Holmes leaned forward, his expression intent, but not aggressive. "Tell us what you know, Anna. Start at the beginning, take your time. We need to understand everything, how it began, who was involved, what exactly was done." She drew a shaky breath, marshalling her thoughts. "It started with the negotiations. Father was frustrated, angry that Count Draculesht wouldn't simply grant everything the village wanted. He said the Count was hiding behind feudal privilege, that the old nobility were parasites who contributed nothing while demanding everything. He wanted the forest lands, wanted to reduce the mill obligations, wanted to end all the old payments. When the negotiations stalled, he began thinking of other ways. To force the Count's hand, Watson prompted gently. Yes, Father has a cousin in Brasov who works for an apothecary. Father visited him, asked questions about chemicals, compounds, things that might create unusual effects. The cousin thought it was for farm purposes, gave him information, even sold him some materials, phosphorescent compounds he called them, substances that glow in darkness. Holmes nodded. The mysterious lights, who actually created them? Who operated them in the forest? Anna's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I did. Father showed me how, taught me to mix the compounds, to paint them on cloth, to set up the rope and pulley system in the clearing. He said we were protecting the village, that the Count was dangerous, that creating fear was necessary to drive him away before he harmed anyone. I believed him at first. I thought we were doing something brave, something protective. And the livestock deaths? Watson asked. Were those natural or deliberate? Father's cow did die naturally. He didn't lie about that. But when he examined it and found the blood had pooled in certain areas, making other areas appear drained, he saw opportunity. He told others the blood was completely gone, embellished the story, let supernatural explanations spread. The other deaths... She paused, shame colouring her face. Father killed them himself, cut their throats, drained the blood into containers which he buried in the forest. Then he made sure the bodies were found in dramatic circumstances, always after the lights had been seen, always reinforcing the pattern. The Count had gone very pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He murdered animals deliberately to frame me as a vampire, destroyed property, spread terror, all for property rights. He convinced himself it was justified, Anna said, tears flowing freely now. He said, "You were the real monster. That nobility had oppressed peasants for centuries, that any method of ending that oppression was righteous." He believed it, truly believed it, or convinced himself he believed it, which amounts to the same thing. Holmes's voice remained gentle, but persistent. "And Father Alexei's illness, that was poison, wasn't it? Aconitine specifically?" Anna nodded miserably. "I prepared it. Father brought monkshood roots from the forest, told me to make tea from them, said it would make the priest sick, but not kill him. I studied herbalism at the convent. The nuns taught us medicinal preparations, warning us about toxic plants and proper dosages. I knew monkshood was dangerous, but Father insisted the dose would be safe, would only cause temporary illness. I prepared the tea, and Father served it to Father Alexei when he stopped at our farm after visiting the castle. The timing was perfect to suggest supernatural retaliation." "Did you understand," Watson asked carefully, "that the dose could have killed him? That aconitine poisoning is unpredictable. That individual response varies. That you were essentially gambling with his life?" "I understand that now," she whispered. "But then, I trusted my father. I believed he wouldn't ask me to do something truly evil. I was wrong. I've been complicit in conspiracy, fraud, animal cruelty, attempted murder. I know the penalties for such crimes, but I cannot live with this burden any more. I cannot watch the village prepare to murder an innocent man while I remain silent about the truth." Holmes stood and began to pace, his mind clearly working through implications, strategies, next steps. "Your testimony is valuable, Anna, but testimony alone may not be sufficient. The village is primed for violence. Belief is deeply entrenched. We need more. We need your father's confession, or we need to catch him in the act of another staged incident. Count, has anything else occurred in recent days? Any new mysterious events?" The Count shook his head. "Nothing since you arrived. Perhaps Petru is being cautious, waiting to see what you discover before staging additional incidents." "Or planning something dramatic," Holmes countered. "Something that will discredit us and justify immediate violence against the Count. Watson, did you notice anything unusual last night? Any lights, sounds, activity?" Watson thought back through the cold night watch. "Nothing definitive, but around midnight I thought I heard voices in the forest, distant, muffled by snow, impossible to be certain. Could have been wind, or wolves, or simply imagination." "Or preparation," Holmes said grimly. "Anna, does your father know you're here? Does he suspect you might confess?" "He doesn't know I'm here. He left early this morning for the mill, said he had business with Ion Stanku. But he's been watching me carefully, knows I've been troubled. Father Alexei's conversation with me last night. If Father learns about that, he'll know I'm wavering. And if he knows I'm wavering..." She trailed off, fear evident. "Then he'll either try to silence you or accelerate his plans before your confession undermines them," Holmes finished. "Which means we may have very limited time. Count, I need you to write a complete account of everything Anna has told us. Have her sign it. Witness it yourself. That creates documentary evidence regardless of what happens next. Watson, you and I are going to the village. If Petru is planning something dramatic, we need to disrupt it before it unfolds." The Count moved immediately to his desk, pulling out paper and pen. Anna looked at Holmes with something approaching gratitude mixed with terror. "If I testify against my father publicly, the village will turn on me. I'll lose everything," home, community, future. Who will marry the girl who betrayed her own father? The girl who chose truth over complicity, Watson said gently. The girl who prevented murder. Those are qualities worth considerably more than local approval, Anna. And if necessary, there are convents that take in women seeking refuge, places where your education and courage would be valued rather than condemned. She nodded slowly, accepting the reality that her decision had severed her old life, that returning to her father's house was no longer possible. Then I'll sign whatever document the Count prepares, and I'll testify publicly if required. But please, she looked at Holmes with desperate intensity, please don't let this end in violence. Whatever my father has done, he's still my father. I don't want him hanged or shot. I want him stopped, but I want him to live. We'll do everything possible to resolve this peacefully, Holmes assured her, though his expression suggested he considered violence a distinct possibility. But understand, Anna, your father has committed serious crimes. There will be consequences. The question is whether those consequences come through law or through mob action. We're trying to ensure the former rather than the latter. 20 minutes later, Watson and Holmes were descending toward the village, both heavily armed. Watson with his revolver, Holmes with a pistol he'd borrowed from the Count's modest armory. The snow made footing treacherous, but the path was clear enough, packed down by Anna's earlier ascent. Behind them, the castle stood solid against the bright sky, and within it, Anna Ionescu sat, writing her confession while the Count witnessed, creating documentary evidence that would either save his life or serve as his epitaph. The village felt different in daylight and clear weather, less Gothic, more simply poor and struggling. Watson could see details obscured by mist and darkness during previous visits, the careful repairs to buildings, the neat stacks of firewood, the small garden plots waiting for spring, all evidence of people working hard to survive in an unforgiving environment. These weren't monsters or fanatics by nature. They were ordinary people who'd been manipulated by one of their own, their legitimate fears and traditional beliefs weaponized for personal gain. Holmes led them directly to Petru's farm, moving with purpose, but not quite running, conveying urgency without panic. The farmyard was quiet, no sign of activity. The barn doors closed against the cold. They were approaching the house when movement caught Watson's eye. Figures gathering near the village centre. Perhaps 20 or 30 people, more arriving constantly. And at the centre of the growing crowd, speaking with animated gestures, stood Petru Ionescu. Too late, Holmes muttered. He's already mobilizing them. Come on, we need to hear what he's saying, understand what narrative he's constructing. They moved closer, staying at the crowd's edge, where they could observe without becoming immediate targets. Petru's voice carried clearly in the cold air, passion lending it projection and force. The English detectives are deceiving you. They come with their science and their evidence, but they serve the vampire, not truth. The Count has seduced them with money, with promises, with his dark powers. And now they hide in his castle, planning how to continue his reign of terror. How many more animals must die? How many of us must fall ill before we act? The authorities in Brasov don't care about us. We're too remote, too insignificant. We must protect ourselves in the old way, the way our ancestors knew was necessary when evil walked among them. The crowd murmured agreement, fear and anger visible on faces, the particular mix of emotions that preceded violence. Watson recognized the dynamic from his military service, the moment when a group of individuals transformed into a mob, when reason became impossible and action inevitable. They needed to interrupt the momentum, but doing so required either overwhelming authority or compelling alternative narrative, and they had neither. Then Father Alexei pushed through the crowd, his black robes and silver cross immediately commanding attention. "Petru, stop this. I've spoken with the English detectives. I've heard their evidence. The Count is not Strigoi. He's an innocent man, victim of deliberate conspiracy to steal his lands. And you," he pointed directly at Petru, his voice carrying absolute conviction, "you are the architect of that conspiracy. You created the lights, you killed the animals, you poisoned me with monkshood tea to make villagers believe the Count had cursed me. I know the truth, and I will not allow murder to be committed based on lies." The crowd went silent, shock rippling through them. Petru's face darkened with fury and something else. Fear, perhaps, recognition that his conspiracy was unraveling. "The priest has been deceived," he shouted, "or worse, corrupted. The vampire's influence is stronger than we thought. We cannot trust anyone who's been to the castle, anyone who's drunk from the vampire's cups or breathed his air. They're all compromised." "Then, how do you explain this?" Holmes stepped forward, holding up the vial of phosphorescent compound, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Material recovered from the forest clearing where your mysterious lights originated. Not supernatural phenomena, Mr. Ionescu, but theatrical effects created using chemicals purchased from your cousin's apothecary in Brasov. We have receipts, we have testimony, we have physical evidence linking you directly to the fabrication of every supposedly supernatural incident." "Lies," Petru shouted, but his voice carried desperation now rather than conviction. "Fabrications created by the vampire and his English servants. You cannot trust them." "Then trust me," Anna's voice rang out, clear and strong. She emerged from behind the church, where she must have followed them from the castle, her face pale but determined. "Trust your own daughter, father. I'm the one who operated the lights. I'm the one who prepared the poison. I did it because you told me to, because I trusted you when you said we were protecting the village. But we weren't protecting anyone. We were destroying an innocent man to steal his property, and I will not be complicit in murder. I've signed a full confession. Everything, the chemicals, the dead animals, the poison, all of it documented, witnessed, ready for Habsburg authorities when they finally arrive." The crowd's attention swung between father and daughter, confusion evident. This wasn't the clear supernatural narrative they'd been fed. This was complicated, human, a family drama with legal and moral dimensions that couldn't be resolved through simple violence. Petru stared at his daughter with an expression that cycled through disbelief, betrayal, and finally cold rage. "You stupid girl," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You've destroyed everything. Everything I built, everything I worked for. For what? For the vampire? For feudal nobility that views us as animals to be exploited. You've betrayed your own blood, your own people, for nothing." "I've betrayed lies," Anna said, tears streaming but voice steady. "I've chosen truth over complicity, and if that makes me traitor in your eyes, father, then I accept that judgment. But I will not accept the blood of an innocent man on my hands. I will not stand silent while murder is committed in the name of protection." The crowd was wavering now. Watson could see it. The momentum broken, doubt creeping in. This was the critical moment, when they might choose reason over violence, or might simply redirect their rage toward new targets. He kept his hand near his revolver, ready, but hoping desperately he wouldn't need to draw it. Ion Stanku, the miller who served as unofficial village headman, pushed forward. He was perhaps 60, grey-bearded, with the careful demeanour of someone who'd learned to navigate competing interests and survive by choosing sides judiciously. "If what the girl says is true," he said, slowly, addressing the crowd rather than any individual, "then we've been deceived, not by the Count, but by one of our own. That's a serious matter. Perhaps we should wait, investigate properly, not act in haste we might regret." "Yes." Father Alexei seized the moment. "Investigation, proper authority, legal resolution. That's the Christian path, the civilized path, not mob violence based on manufactured fear. The Count has agreed to suspend all negotiations about property rights until this matter is resolved. He's offered to submit to Habsburg investigation, to open his castle to official inspection. He has nothing to hide because he's done nothing wrong." Petru looked around at the wavering crowd, seeing his conspiracy crumbling, his carefully constructed narrative falling apart. For a moment, Watson thought he might simply surrender, might accept defeat and face legal consequences. But then, something changed in his expression. Desperation becoming dangerous, cornered fury replacing calculation. "If I cannot have justice," Petru said quietly, almost conversationally, "then at least I'll have revenge." He pulled a knife from his belt, the same large blade Watson had noticed during their first visit, and before anyone could react, he turned and ran, not toward the crowd, but toward the castle path, moving with surprising speed for a man his age. "He's going after the Count," Holmes shouted, already moving. "He's alone in the castle, except for the servant woman. Watson, come on." They ran, plunging through snow that grabbed at their legs, slowing them. Behind, Watson could hear others following. Father Alexei, Ion Stanku, some of the younger men from the village. The crowd was transforming again, this time from mob to rescue party. The dynamics shifting with the bewildering speed that characterized group behavior in crisis. The climb to the castle was brutal, steep, snow-covered, altitude stealing breath. Watson's legs burned, his lungs ached, but he pushed through, fear for the Count overriding physical discomfort. Holmes was ahead, moving with that peculiar energy he could summon when needed, and Petru was farther ahead still, desperate fury lending him speed. They reached the castle courtyard to find the gate still open. Anna must not have closed it when she left. Petru had already crossed the bridge, disappeared inside. Holmes drew his borrowed pistol, Watson his revolver, and they entered cautiously, unsure what they'd find. The great hall was empty, fire burning low, breakfast dishes still on the table. No sign of struggle, no sound except their own harsh breathing. Then, from above, they heard voices, raised, angry. One of them, the Count's cultured tones, the other, Petru's rough peasant accent. The Eastern Tower. They took the spiral stairs 2 at a time, muscles screaming protest, weapons ready. At the top, the laboratory door stood open, and inside, Watson could see the Count backed against his workbench, hands raised, placatingly, while Petru advanced with his knife, murder evident in his stance. "Petru, stop," Holmes commanded, levelling his pistol. "It's over. Your daughter has confessed everything. The village knows the truth. Killing the Count now won't change anything except add murder to your crimes." Petru didn't turn, didn't lower the knife. "He's taken everything from me. My property rights, my dignity, now my own daughter. He deserves death, and I'll gladly hang for delivering it." "I've taken nothing," the Count said quietly, his voice remarkably steady for a man facing death. "You destroyed yourself, Petru. Your greed, your willingness to harm others for personal gain, your manipulation of fear, those choices were yours. I'm simply the convenient target you selected for schemes that had nothing to do with actual grievance and everything to do with ambition." "Lies!" Petru lunged forward, knife flashing toward the Count's chest. Watson fired without conscious thought, military training overriding hesitation. The revolver's report was deafening in the stone room, and Petru jerked backward, the knife clattering to the floor. He clutched his shoulder where Watson's bullet had struck, blood welling between his fingers, his face showing shock and pain. "Not a killing shot," Watson said, moving forward with his medical bag already opening. "You'll survive, Petru. You'll stand trial, face legal consequences, but you'll survive. I'm a doctor. I don't kill when wounding is sufficient." The fight went out of Petru like air from a punctured bladder. He collapsed to his knees, and Watson immediately began treating the wound. Practical, professional, the same care he'd provide to any injured patient regardless of circumstance or character. Behind them, Father Alexei and Ion Stancu arrived, breathing hard, taking in the scene with expressions of relief and somber recognition that their community's crisis had reached its violent culmination, but would go no further. "It's finished," Holmes said, lowering his pistol. "The conspiracy is exposed, the perpetrator stopped, the truth documented. Habsburg authorities can take over from here, conduct proper investigation, deliver proper justice. Count Draculesht, you're exonerated. The village owes you apology and probably restitution, though I doubt you'll receive either with particular grace." The Count slumped against his workbench, the accumulated strain of months suddenly visible in his posture. "I don't want restitution. I just want peace. I want to return to my chemicals and my books and my solitary walks without fear of being murdered for existing. Is that possible?" "It's possible," Watson said, working on Petru's shoulder with practiced efficiency. "Though it will take time for trust to rebuild, for fear to fade. Communities heal slowly from this kind of trauma. But truth is powerful medicine, and eventually it does its work." They descended from the tower in solemn procession, Petru supported by Father, Alexei and Ion Stancu, Watson following to ensure the wounded man didn't collapse, Holmes and the Count bringing up the rear. In the great hall, Anna waited, her face showing relief and sorrow in equal measure when she saw her father alive but wounded, stopped but not killed. "Thank you," she said to Watson, her voice barely above a whisper, "for not killing him, for giving him chance to face justice rather than death. That's more mercy than he probably deserves. But it's what I prayed for." The village men took custody of Petru, agreeing to hold him until proper authorities could be summoned from Brasov. The wound wasn't life-threatening, Watson assured them, but required monitoring to prevent infection. He provided instructions, left supplies, played the role of doctor regardless of his patient's crimes. By evening, the crisis had passed. Word had spread through Magura, the truth about the phantom, about Petru's conspiracy, about the Count's innocence. The reaction was complex: shame, anger at being deceived, relief that actual supernatural threat didn't exist, resentment toward the Count mixed with grudging acknowledgement that he'd been wronged. Human, complicated, messy, in the way that truth always is when it displaces comfortable narrative. Holmes and Watson prepared to depart the following morning. The snow had cleared enough to make the journey to Brasov feasible, and staying longer served no purpose. Their investigation was complete, their client vindicated, justice set in motion. What remained was the slow work of community healing, and that was beyond their expertise or responsibility. The Count saw them off personally, pressing generous payment into Holmes's hands despite his protests, adding extra for their return journey and accommodations. "You gave me back my life," he said simply. "My sanity, my future. That's worth considerably more than money, but money is what I have to offer. Thank you, both of you. I won't forget what you've done." Anna appeared as they were preparing to leave, approaching shyly. She carried a small package wrapped in cloth. "For your journey," she said. "Bread and cheese from the farm. And this," she held out a folded paper. "A letter, if you'd be willing to deliver it to the convent school in Brasov. I'm requesting admission, seeking refuge. I cannot stay in Magura, not after what's happened. Father Alexei has agreed to provide recommendation, but I need to make formal application." Watson took the letter carefully. "We'll deliver it personally. And Anna, you did the right thing. That requires courage most people never have to demonstrate. The sisters will recognize that, I'm certain." The journey back to Brasov was long, but unremarkable. The ordinary discomfort of winter travel through mountains, the tedium of train compartments and station platforms, the gradual return to civilization's comforts and complications. They reached Vienna, then Munich, then Paris, the cities growing, progressively more familiar as they travelled westward toward England and home. On the Channel crossing, standing at the rail, watching grey water roll beneath grey sky, Watson finally asked the question that had been troubling him. "Do you think it will last, the truth, the peace, or will fear return once we're gone, once memory fades?" Holmes considered, his sharp profile outlined against the sullen sky. "Some will always prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truth, Watson. Human nature doesn't change, and superstition has roots deeper than reason. But we've planted doubt, created documentation, demonstrated that natural explanation exists for supposedly supernatural events. That's not nothing. That's the difference between ignorance and willful ignorance. And some people, not all, but some, will choose truth once they've seen it clearly." "You're an optimist, Holmes. I never realized." "I'm a realist who understands that progress is incremental, that battles against irrationality are never finally won, but must be fought repeatedly, in each generation, in each community. We didn't save the world in those Carpathian hills, Watson. We saved one man, exposed one conspiracy, helped one village take small step toward modernity. That's all. But that's also everything. It's how civilization advances. One rational choice at a time, one truth revealed, one supernatural explanation replaced by natural understanding." London welcomed them with its familiar fog, its coal smoke perfume, its endless busyness that was both exhausting and oddly comforting after the mountain silence. Baker Street looked exactly as they'd left it. Mrs. Hudson fussing about the dust, the fire laid ready for lighting, the familiar books and chairs and comfortable disorder that meant home. That evening, settled into his chair with pipe and paper, Watson began writing. Not for publication immediately. Some stories required distance before they could be properly told. but for record, for memory, for the simple satisfaction of capturing truth before time softened its edges. He wrote of castles and mountains, of fear and manipulation, of a lonely nobleman accused of impossible crimes, and a young woman who chose conscience over loyalty. He wrote of phosphorescent compounds and poisoned tea, of mobs and confessions, of the thin line between reason and superstition that every human community negotiates with varying success. And he wrote of Holmes, that peculiar genius whose absolute faith in rationality was itself almost mystical, whose certainty that every mystery had natural explanation bordered on religious conviction, who fought darkness not with holy water and crucifixes, but with chemistry and logic and relentless observation, who proved again and again that monsters were always human, and humanity was always capable of both extraordinary evil and extraordinary courage. Outside, London settled into evening. Somewhere in the great city, crimes were being committed, mysteries accumulating, people wrestling with their own small dramas of fear and greed and love and loss. Tomorrow or next week or next month, someone would knock on the door of 221B Baker Street, bringing Holmes a new puzzle, a new challenge to his conviction that reason could explain everything. But tonight, in the quiet comfort of gaslight and familiar spaces, Watson simply wrote, recording truth for those who might someday want to read about the phantom of the Carpathian hills, and the detectives who proved that phantoms are always, ultimately, only human. The fire crackled. Holmes played his violin, something slow and satisfied, and outside the fog pressed close. London's particular mystery, beautiful and ordinary and entirely natural, like all mysteries once you understood their causes. The game, for now, was complete. And Watson, writing steadily in his careful doctor's hand, found himself smiling, grateful for adventure, grateful for partnership, grateful for the simple, persistent truth that reason, given chance and courage, could illuminate even the darkest corners. The phantom was unmasked, the mystery was solved. And tomorrow, as always, would bring new challenges, new puzzles, new opportunities to prove that the supernatural didn't exist. Only the natural, sometimes deliberately obscured, always eventually revealed to those patient and observant enough to look. Thank you for joining this journey into the Carpathian shadows. May your own sleep be peaceful, your dreams free of phantoms, except the beautiful, harmless ones that remind us that wonder exists not in supernatural explanation, but in the endless, fascinating complexity of the natural world and the human hearts that navigate.